Hey there, story lovers. This is Watch Harry, and we're bringing you an epic adventure. Petunia filed a formal ICW complaint and Dumbledore lost 15 Supreme Mugwump privileges in one hearing. Hit like, subscribe, and let's begin this journey. Chapter 1, The Audit. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Petunia Dursley almost didn't open it. It was pale gray, sealed with a wax stamp she didn't recognize, a set of scales inside a circle of stars, and the handwriting on the front was so precise it looked typeset. She'd gotten wizarding correspondence before. It always made her stomach clench in a specific way, like touching a hot pan before the heat fully registered. She'd learned, over 30 years, to recognize that particular brand of dread. She set it on the kitchen counter and made herself a cup of tea first. Vernon was at work. Dudley was at his flat in Bristol, doing whatever Dudley did these days. She suspected it involved a girl named Karen and a great deal of takeaway, which was fine. She loved him, but the details were his own. The house was quiet. The kitchen smelled like the lemon washing up liquid she'd used on the breakfast things, and the morning light came through the window at the low, golden angle it only managed in late October, and Petunia stood at the counter and drank her tea and looked at the letter and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not dread, exactly. Something older than that. She opened it. Dear Mrs. Dursley, my name is Cassius Vane. I am a Level 3 magical audit specialist with the International Confederation of Wizards, currently seconded to the British Ministry of Magic Special Records Division. I am writing to you in a personal and unofficial capacity prior to any formal proceedings, which is a courtesy extended to all individuals identified in our current review. I would like to meet with you at your earliest convenience to discuss findings relevant to your magical record. I understand this may come as a surprise. I would ask only that you not dismiss this letter before we have spoken. What I have found warrants a conversation. Yours sincerely, Cassius Vane, ICW Audit Division, Case Reference 7741 PEVA. Contact address and flow point, if applicable, are enclosed. I am also reachable by Muggle post at the address below, if you prefer. Petunia read it twice. Then she set it down on the counter beside her teacup and looked out the window at the garden, which needed cutting back. She'd been meaning to do it for 2 weeks. My magical record. She picked the letter up again, turned it over, looked at the return address. A post office box in London. Muggle post. She appreciated that. She appreciated it more than she expected to. She reached for the phone. Cassius Vane was younger than his letter had implied. He was perhaps 30, with dark circles under his eyes and the slightly rumpled look of someone who slept under their desk more than they admitted to. He turned up at her front door at 3 o'clock on Thursday carrying a leather satchel so stuffed with papers that the clasp had given up. He was wearing a suit that almost fit. Mrs. Dursley, he said. Thank you for agreeing to see me. You said it warranted a conversation, Petunia said. Come in. Tea? Please, he said, with the relief of someone who'd been running on bad coffee for days. She put the kettle on and watched him settle himself at the kitchen table, pulling files from his satchel with the careful urgency of a man who'd been waiting to lay them out somewhere proper. He had good hands, the hands of someone precise, she noticed. He handled the papers like they mattered. Before you explain anything, Petunia said, setting a mug in front of him and sitting across the table, I want to know how you found me. He wrapped his hands around the mug. I was assigned to a routine audit of international magical privileges held by British nationals, he said. It's standard procedure, runs every 7 years, mostly bureaucratic tidying. Checking that certain high-level authorization certificates are still warranted, that the documentation underpinning older decisions still holds up. He paused. I was auditing the records of a specific individual. I can't name them yet, not officially, not until you decide whether to engage formally, and in those records, I found a secondary magical signature. Mine, Petunia said. He looked up at her. Yes. The kettle had boiled. The kitchen was quiet. Tell me what that means, she said. He opened the first file. When I found the signature, I initially flagged it as an administrative anomaly. Magical signatures turn up in all kinds of records, proximity records, witness certifications, property wards. I wasn't alarmed. He slid a page across the table toward her. It was covered in what looked like sheet music, if sheet music had been designed by someone who found notes insufficiently complicated. But this isn't a proximity record. This is a suppression certificate. Petunia looked at the page. Explain that to me as if I'm not a witch, she said. Because I'm not. Cassius Vane was quiet for just a moment too long. Mrs. Dursley, he said, that's rather the point. A suppression certificate is a legal document that authorizes the binding of an individual's magical capacity. He said it carefully, watching her face. It requires the informed and witnessed consent of the individual being bound. It requires counter-signature from a ministry-certified binder. And it requires, under the Magical Persons Autonomy Act of 1952, that the bound individual be provided with a full copy of the document and a quarterly review option. He paused. The certificate I found has your magical signature on it. It's been active since 1965. You would have been 8 years old. The room didn't move. The light through the window didn't change. Somewhere outside, a car went past. Petunia sat very, very still. I don't recall signing anything, she said, and her voice was very steady. No, Cassius Vane said. I don't imagine you do. She looked at the page again. At the cramped magical notation that meant nothing to her and apparently meant everything. She thought about the day Lily got her Hogwarts letter. She thought about the way she'd felt, not just envious, not just left behind, but severed, like something had been cut away that should never have been removed. She'd always assumed that was just grief. The grief of being ordinary. She'd built 30 years on top of that grief. She'd built a house and a marriage and a son and a life that was hers, unremarkable and safe and nothing like the world that had swallowed her sister whole. And now this young man with his dark-circled eyes was sitting at her kitchen table telling her that it had been a choice. Someone else's choice. Who signed it, she said. It wasn't a question. Cassius hesitated. I want to be careful here, Mrs. Dursley, because, who signed it? He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned the page around and pointed to the counter-signature at the bottom. The handwriting was elaborate. Looping. Familiar from every letter she'd spent 30 years learning to resent on sight. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Petunia looked at the signature for a long time. Long enough that Cassius shifted slightly in his seat, watching her with the careful attention of someone who isn't sure what direction the next several seconds will go. Right, she said finally. She got up. She refilled the kettle. She stood at the counter with her back to him, and she breathed, once, twice, very deliberately. She was not going to cry. Not about this. Not in front of a stranger, not in her kitchen, not over a man who'd been making her choices for her since she was 8 years old. She was not going to give Albus Dumbledore her tears in absentia. She'd given him enough already. She turned around. You said this was unofficial, she said. You said you came in a personal capacity before formal proceedings. Yes, Cassius said. Which means you could have filed this as an administrative anomaly, closed it, and moved on. Yes. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment, turning his mug in his hands. Because my job, technically, is to audit the records of the individual whose files I was reviewing. I found your signature in those records. The correct thing to do, administratively, was to note it and move on, because you're not the subject of the audit. He paused. But a suppression certificate issued to an 8-year-old without a guardian's formal petition, without a Wisengamot authorization, and without any of the quarterly review correspondence that should exist, that's not an administrative anomaly, Mrs. Dursley. That's a serious breach of the Magical Persons Autonomy Act. At minimum. At minimum, she repeated. The certificate was issued under the Supreme Mugwump's Emergency Authorization Clause, Cassius said, which allows the Supreme Mugwump to authorize a suppression without Wisengamot oversight in cases of, and I'm quoting, imminent magical danger to the public. An 8-year-old girl who hadn't manifested any dangerous magical symptoms. He straightened the papers. There's no petition on file. No danger assessment. No review correspondence at all. Just the certificate, your signature, which you could not have given meaningful consent to at age 8, and his. Petunia sat back down. How many of these can he issue, she said. Under that clause. It has no statutory limit, Cassius said. It was designed for genuine emergencies. Dark wizard incidents, uncontrolled outbursts that threatened Muggle exposure. It was never intended to be used on children whose sisters were more magical than they were, Petunia said. Cassius said nothing. Which was, she supposed, answer enough. She looked at the certificate again. At her signature, rendered in the magical notation she had no memory of giving, that she could not have meaningfully given. Lily had gone to Hogwarts in September 1971. Petunia had applied the year before, she remembered that, remembered finding the owl, remembered the letter she'd sent to Dumbledore himself, asking to come, saying she wanted to learn. She remembered the reply. A gentle, regretful letter about the nature of magical ability, about how Hogwarts was not able to accommodate those without the gift, about how she was sure she would find her own remarkable path. She'd been 11. She'd believed him. Why wouldn't she have? He was Dumbledore. And 3 years before that, when she was 8, 3 years before she wrote that letter believing herself ordinary, someone had already ensured that she would be. What, she said slowly, would happen if I filed a formal complaint? Cassius sat up a little straighter. He'd been waiting for this. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, not surprise, preparation. He'd prepared for this answer. A formal complaint filed with the ICW against a sitting Supreme Mugwump triggers mandatory review, he said. The Confederation would be required to convene a privileges hearing within 90 days. At that hearing, the complainant presents evidence, the subject responds, and the panel of senior adjudicators determines whether any of the Supreme Mugwump's operational privileges, the authorizations that allow him to take actions like the one taken against you, should be suspended, revoked, or restricted. How many privileges does he hold? Petunia asked. In his current capacity, Cassius said, 31. She looked at the certificate. At his signature. At her signature, given when she was 8 years old and had no idea what was being taken from her. You brought the complaint forms, she said. It wasn't a guess. Cassius reached into his satchel and produced a sheaf of pale gray paper. I did, he said. Leave them, she said. I'd like to read them on my own. Of course. He began to gather his files. Mrs. Dursley, I want to be honest with you. The ICW will take this seriously. The evidence is substantial. But Albus Dumbledore has considerable standing in international magical governance. This won't be simple. Petunia looked at him with the steady, level expression she'd perfected over decades of being the unremarkable sister in a remarkable world. Mr. Vane, she said, I've been managing difficult institutions since I was 8 years old. I know how to read a room. I know how to prepare a case. I know how to make sure the right people hear the right information at the right time. She folded her hands on the table. What I have never had before is the paperwork. He almost smiled. Then I'll see myself out. She read the complaint forms that evening. All 42 pages of them. Vernon came home at 6 to find her at the kitchen table surrounded by carefully organized stacks of paper, a pot of tea gone cold beside her, and a yellow legal pad covered in her small, precise handwriting. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the pale gray forms and the official-looking stamps and went very still in the particular way he had when anything magical touched the edges of their life. Pet, he said carefully. "Sit down, Vernon," she said, without looking up. He sat. She finished the note she was writing and capped her pen and looked at him. She'd been deciding, on and off, for the past 4 hours, how much to tell him. How much she could tell him. Because the thing about Vernon, the thing she'd understood about her husband for years with a clarity she'd never put into words, was that Vernon had always known she was different, and had never known how to love that part of her, only the absence of it. He'd loved the version of her that was entirely, irrefutably mundane. It was one of the things that had made her love him back. But there was something else. Something she'd been circling all afternoon. "The wizard," she said. "Dumbledore. You've met him once." "On the doorstep," Vernon said. "Years ago. Before the boy, before Harry," she said. He shifted. "Yes. He told you something," she said. "About me. About why it was important that you take Harry, why it was important that Harry be contained. He gave you a reason." "I've always known he gave you something, Vernon. Some explanation. Because you were never hateful before the boy came, and after." She stopped herself. "Tell me what he said." The kitchen was very quiet. Vernon's jaw worked for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table, big square hands, a builder's hands even though he'd spent 30 years behind a desk selling drills. He looked uncomfortable in the way of a man who knows the truth is worse than the silence. "He said you'd had a magical breakdown when you were a girl," Vernon said at last. "A dangerous one. That you'd been treated. Stabilized. And that if you were ever exposed to too much magic, if the boy was too present, too much, it could." He stopped. "He said it could hurt me," Petunia said. "He said it could hurt you," Vernon repeated. Petunia breathed in. Breathed out. "That's why," she said softly. Not to Vernon. Mostly to herself. "That's why you were the way you were. That's why you kept him at arm's length, why you made Dudley." "I was protecting you," Vernon said, and there was something raw and bewildered in his voice that she hadn't heard in years. "Pet, I thought I was protecting you." She looked at him, this man she'd built a life with, whom she'd loved, whom she'd sometimes resented, who'd sometimes been cruel in the particular way of frightened people acting out of fear they never examined, and she saw it clearly for the first time. Not an excuse. Not a justification. But a picture. Dumbledore had not simply bound her magic. He had taken that binding and built a whole architecture around it. He had given Vernon a story that made cruelty feel like protection, that made Harry's misery serve a purpose, that made every Dursley dinner table argument and locked cupboard and deliberate unkindness into something Vernon had believed, genuinely believed, was keeping his wife safe. It was elegant, she thought. In a horrible way. It was elegant. "He lied to you," she said. "He lied to both of us." "What are you going to do?" Vernon said. She looked down at the pale gray complaint form. At the space-marked nature of grievance. At the blank lines waiting to be filled. "I'm going to find a solicitor," she said. "A good one." Rhea Thornwood came recommended by Cassius Vane, who had apparently made it his quiet, unofficial business to be extremely helpful throughout this whole process. She practiced magical law out of an office on a street in London that Petunia had to be given written directions to find, because it sat between a dry cleaner's and a bookshop in a way that strongly suggested it didn't want to be discovered. She was a tall woman in her late 40s, brown-skinned, with natural hair pinned up in a way that managed to look both professional and entirely untroubled. She had 3 degrees visible on her wall and 3 more in a stack on her desk that she apparently hadn't bothered to frame, and she read through the suppression certificate and the complaint forms and all of Petunia's legal pad notes with the focused attention of someone encountering not a problem but a project. "The certificate is illegal on 4 separate grounds," Rhea said, without looking up from the page. The emergency clause was not designed to be applied to a child with no documented dangerous incidents. The consent signature is invalid under the 1952 Act because you were a minor and there's no guardian petition authorizing consent by proxy. There's no Wiesengemot seal, which means the emergency authorization was self-issued, which is only permissible in genuinely documented emergencies. And, she turned the page, there are no quarterly review records, which means even if the original certificate had been legal, it's been maintained in violation of ongoing statutory requirements for 60 years. I was 8, Petunia said. You were 8, Rhea confirmed, setting the page down and looking at her directly. Mrs. Dursley, I want to be straightforward with you. I've worked in magical law for 20 years. I've seen suppressions before. I've even seen a few that were improperly filed. But this, the scope of this, the duration, the identity of the signatory, the deliberate absence of review records, this is not a filing error. This is a calculated action taken by the most powerful wizard in Britain against a child who posed no threat to anyone. Yes, Petunia said. Rhea studied her for a moment. You're very calm, she said. I'm not calm, Petunia said. I'm decided. There's a difference. The corner of Rhea's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. All right, she said. Then let me tell you what a proper formal complaint looks like. Not the standard forms Vane gave you, those are the starting point. What I'm talking about is a comprehensive submission. Evidence packet, personal testimony, statutory analysis, documented harm assessment, and a request for full privilege review. We don't ask for an apology. We don't ask for an acknowledgement. We ask the ICW to examine every single authorization Dumbledore holds that stems from the same emergency clause he used on you, and we ask them to determine whether those authorizations were used within their lawful scope. How many of his 31 privileges trace back to that clause? Petunia asked. Rhea opened a second file. Cassius Vane prepared a preliminary analysis, she said. 15. Petunia looked at the list. 15 rows. 15 privileges, each with a reference number and a date and a brief description. The emergency clause, used 15 times in various configurations, to expand Dumbledore's scope of unilateral action over everything from suppression certificates to confidential ministry oversight to the authority to place magical subjects in non-magical households without formal wardship proceedings. She read that last one twice. The clause that let him leave Harry with me, she said. Without a formal wardship application, Rhea said. Without a guardianship review. Without notifying the Magical Child Welfare Office. Yes. He did it to both of us, Petunia said. He used the same mechanism. He bound me with it and he used it again to place Harry. She stopped. How old was Harry when he was left with us? 15 months, Rhea said, gently. The kitchen cupboard under the stairs. The 2 small clothes. The birthday cake with 1 candle and the words "Don't make a fuss." 30 years of decisions she'd made, decisions that felt like her own, within a framework someone had built around her without her knowledge or permission. I want to file the comprehensive complaint, Petunia said. It will take time to prepare properly, Rhea said. 3 weeks, minimum. I want it to be undeniable. Take the 3 weeks, Petunia said. I want it to be undeniable too. Rhea nodded. Then she said, more quietly, Mrs. Dursley, your nephew. Harry Potter. He should probably know about this before it becomes public. Petunia was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. The ICW process isn't private, once it's underway. The wizarding press, I know, Petunia said again. I'll tell him. She said it with the same steady certainty with which she'd said everything else in this meeting, because she was decided, not calm, and the two things felt different in ways she was still learning to map. But underneath the certainty, somewhere in the region of her chest, was something that felt very much like being 8 years old and writing a letter to a man who'd already ensured she would never get the answer she was asking for. She was going to tell Harry. She just needed a day or two to figure out how to say I'm sorry, and also everything you thought you knew about why your life was the way it was, some of it was done to both of us, by the man you trusted most. How to say that without it sounding like an excuse? How to say it like the truth? She rang him on a Friday. Harry Potter's voice on the phone still surprised her, slightly. He'd had a boy's voice the last time she'd thought of him as a person rather than a problem, and he'd grown into something steadier without her noticing. He lived in London now. He was, she gathered from the news, from Ria's preliminary research, from the fragments of information that occasionally reached her through the usual gaps between their worlds, an auror. Someone who chased dark wizards. Which struck her as a terrible job, and also, knowing what she now knew about how he'd been raised, entirely unsurprising. Aunt Petunia, he said, and there was a careful note in his voice. They were careful with each other now, had been since he was 17. Not warm. Not cold. Just careful. Like people who share a history they've agreed not to discuss but haven't quite managed to forget. I need to see you, she said. In person. There's something I have to tell you. A pause. Is everything all right? Is it Uncle Vernon? Everyone's fine, she said. This is about something else. Something I've learned. That involves you. Another pause, longer. Okay, he said. I can come Sunday. Sunday, she said. Yes. Come for lunch. She made shepherd's pie, which felt appropriate, the most ordinary thing she could think of, something warm and real and nothing to do with any of it. She set the table properly, good dishes, not the everyday ones, and she put the file Cassius Vane had given her on the counter and she waited. Harry arrived exactly on time, which was a habit she'd never been able to fault him for. He came to the door in a dark jacket with his perpetually unruly hair and those round glasses that made him look younger than he was, and she stepped back to let him in and thought, with a sudden and unexpected clarity, that he had Lily's eyes. He'd always had Lily's eyes. She'd always known this. But she'd buried it, for years, under everything else it was easier to feel. Come in, she said. Lunch is nearly ready. They ate at the kitchen table. She'd made too much, the way she always did, the way her mother had, the way that meant something about care even when the people receiving it didn't know it was being given. Harry ate with the slightly concentrated appreciation of someone who doesn't cook much. They talked, about Dudley, about Vernon's retirement plans, about nothing in particular, and it was almost comfortable, which was more than it had ever been. She waited until the plates were cleared. Then she put Cassius Vane's file on the table. She watched Harry's face as he read the suppression certificate. Watched him read it again. Watched the careful neutrality he'd learned, the face of someone trained to assess information before reacting to it, crack at the edges. He bound your magic, Harry said. When you were 8. Yes. Without your consent. Without anyone's formal consent, she said. Without Wiesengemot authorization. Without a danger assessment. Without any of the legal requirements. Harry set the page down very carefully, like it might do something if handled wrong. Why, he said. I don't know, she said. Not all of it. Not yet. But I was Lily's older sister. I wanted to go to Hogwarts. I wrote to him at 11 and he told me I had no magic. She paused. He'd made sure of that 3 years earlier. Harry was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the garden she still hadn't got round to cutting back. The afternoon light was thinning. He put me with you, Harry said at last. Using the same authorization clause he used to bind me, she said. Yes. She watched him process that. Watched him do the math, the cupboard under the stairs, the years of misery he'd never talked about to her directly, the life he'd lived in this house that she had enabled and enabled and enabled while believing she had no choice, while believing she was protecting something, while believing the entire architecture of her own existence. Aunt Petunia, he said, I don't blame, Harry, she said, don't. He stopped. Don't tell me you don't blame me, she said. Not yet. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know, and because it's going to become public soon and I won't have you finding out from a newspaper. But I'm not looking for absolution. I'm looking at this clearly and I need you to look at it clearly too. She folded her hands on the table. I filed a complaint. With the ICW. Against Dumbledore. He stared at her. A formal complaint, she said. My solicitor is finishing the submission now. 47 pages of evidence, statutory analysis, and documented harm. When it's filed, it triggers a mandatory privileges hearing. The panel will review every authorization he holds that uses the same emergency clause. There are 15 of them. Harry was still staring. Petunia, he said, and it was the first time in 30 years she could recall him using just her name, he's Dumbledore. She met his eyes, Lily's eyes, green and stunned and trying to recalibrate, and she said, very simply, I know. He has, the entire wizarding world, I know. He could, Harry. Her voice was even. Quiet. I was 8 years old when he decided what my life was going to be. I did not make that choice. Every choice that came after, every hard year in this house, every difficult thing between us, everything you lived through that you shouldn't have had to, all of it was downstream of that moment. She looked at him steadily. He gets to answer for it. In a proper hearing, with proper evidence, in front of people who have the authority to make it matter. That is the most reasonable thing I have ever wanted. Harry looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he said, can I help? And that was the thing she hadn't expected. Not the question itself, but the way he asked it. No hesitation. No, are you sure? No, but he's powerful, no careful management of her expectations. Just the immediate, practical, straightforward offer of a person who had decided which side of a line to stand on. She felt something loosen, very slightly, in the center of her chest. Yes, she said. I think perhaps you can. She poured them both more tea, and outside the wind moved through the garden, and the afternoon light went gold and then gray, and they stayed at the table for another 2 hours while she showed him everything Cassius Vane had found. All of it. For the first time in 30 years, she didn't keep anything from him. 3 weeks later, on a Monday morning, Rhea Thornwood walked into the ICW regional office in London with a 47-page submission and a supplementary evidence packet of 212 pages, signed, notarized, and copied in triplicate. The junior clerk at the front desk took it, looked at the name of the complainant, looked at the name of the subject, and looked back at Rhea. This will need to go to the senior review office, he said. Yes, Rhea said. It will. By afternoon, the senior review office had escalated it to the privileges division. By evening, the privileges division had briefed the chief adjudicator. By Wednesday, Albus Dumbledore had been formally notified. By Thursday, someone from the Daily Prophet had gotten hold of the case reference number. By Friday, all of Wizarding Britain was talking about it. And in a house in Little Whinging, with her garden finally cut back and a new legal pad already half full on the kitchen table, Petunia Dursley read through her copy of the filed complaint one more time, made a small correction in the margin, and allowed herself, privately, the first uncomplicated satisfaction she had felt in a very long time. Chapter 2. The 47 pages The Daily Prophet ran it on the front page with a photograph of Dumbledore taken at some gala 3 years prior, looking distinguished and benevolent and entirely unaware that a woman in Surrey was about to take his life's work apart at the seams. The headline read, Muggleborn Sister Files ICW Complaint Against Supreme Mugwump, Suppression Allegations Rock Wizarding Establishment. Which was, Rhea told Petunia over the phone that Friday morning, about as measured as the Prophet ever got. They're calling you Muggleborn Sister, Petunia noted. They don't know what else to call you yet, Rhea said. Give it a week. They'll figure out you're the interesting one. By the end of that same Friday, 4 other wizarding publications had picked it up. Two were cautious, measured, full of careful sourcing and a great deal of alleged. One was openly dismissive, a columnist named Algernon Wretch, who wrote 800 words about the dangers of Muggle interference in magical governance and managed to use the word hysterical 4 times without apparent irony. And one, a small independent publication called the Magical Review, ran a 3,000-word analysis of the ICW privileges hearing process that was so accurate and so clearly sourced from someone who'd read the actual complaint that Petunia suspected Cassius Vane had a subscription. The wizarding world, she gathered, was experiencing something between scandal and vertigo. She made herself breakfast, read through the coverage Rhea had forwarded by Muggle email, and wrote down 3 names on her legal pad: the columnist, the publication that got the process right, and a name that appeared in 2 separate articles as someone who had declined to comment. Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, did not respond to requests for comment by press time. She underlined Amelia Bones. Vernon read the profit coverage because Harry had sent it through Muggle Post, a thoughtful detail that suggested Harry was paying more attention to the logistics of all this than he let on. Vernon sat at the kitchen table on Saturday morning with the pages spread out in front of him and read every word with the focused, slightly pained expression of a man doing something he knows he needs to do and doesn't entirely want to. When he finished, he put the pages down and said nothing for a long moment. "He told me you'd be hurt," Vernon said. "If there was too much magic around you. He said you were fragile." He said the word like it had been sitting in his mouth for 30 years, turning. "He sat on my doorstep and looked me in the eye and told me that keeping the boy, keeping Harry at a distance was medical. That it was what you needed." "I know," Petunia said. "I believed him." Vernon's voice was flat. Not apologetic exactly, but stripped of its usual bluster, the way he sounded when something had gone past the point where performance was useful. He seemed so certain, Pet. He was so calm about it. Like it was obvious. Like I'd have been a fool not to understand. "He was very good at that," Petunia said. Vernon looked up at her. Are you angry? With me?" She thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to think about everything lately, without the filters she'd maintained for years. Without the protective habit of managing her own feelings before anyone else could see them. "I think I was angry with you for years about things I didn't fully understand," she said. "And now I understand more, and I'm mostly angry with him." "But Vernon," she paused. "Harry was a child. Whatever reason you thought you had, whatever he told you, Harry was a child, and we made his life smaller than it needed to be." Vernon looked at his hands on the table. Big square hands. He didn't argue. "I know," he said. "It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't resolution. But it was honest, which was more than most of the conversations in this house had been, and Petunia decided that was enough for now. Harry came back on Sunday without being asked. He arrived with a folder of his own, dense, parchment-heavy, tied with a ribbon in a way that was distinctly wizard, and he set it on the table beside Petunia's legal pad and said, "I pulled everything I could from ministry records. Or access. I'm probably not supposed to use it for personal research but," he shrugged, in the particular way he had of making rule-breaking look like common sense. "I thought it might help." Petunia looked at the folder. "What's in it?" "Every documented instance of Dumbledore invoking the emergency authorization clause," Harry said. "Going back to 1959. Cassius Vane's list had 15 that are relevant to your complaint. But there are 23 total uses on record. Some of them have proper documentation, genuine emergencies, dark wizard incidents, things that actually fit the scope." He opened the folder and pointed to a tabbed section. "These 8 are fine. The other 15 are what Rhea already found," Petunia said. "The other 15 are what Rhea already found," Harry confirmed. "But the ministry records give us something the ICW audit didn't, the internal memos. The correspondence between Dumbledore and the ministry officials who should have been providing independent oversight for each invocation." He looked at her. They didn't. They were told not to, Petunia guessed. They were told it wasn't necessary, Harry said. Different thing, technically. A few of them pushed back, apparently. There are memos, polite, careful memos from ministry officials saying they'd like to conduct the standard review, and there are responses from Dumbledore that are perfectly reasonable and explain why the standard review wasn't applicable in this specific case. He paused. And then the officials signed off and the review didn't happen. The officials believed him, Petunia said. He was very good at that, Harry said. She looked at him. He'd said it the same way she had, earlier, to Vernon, and she wondered if he'd heard her say it or arrived at it independently. Add these to the evidence packet, she told him. Email them to Rhea. Already done, he said. Sent them Thursday night. She looked at him again, this time with something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. He'd moved fast. He'd moved quietly. He'd done it without waiting for her to ask. Lily used to do that too, she thought. Move quietly and efficiently toward the things that mattered before anyone told her they needed doing. She looked back at the folder. How are you? She asked. With all of this. Harry was quiet for a moment. He'd taken his jacket off, was sitting at her kitchen table in a dark jumper with his tea, and he looked like, she searched for it, he looked like someone reorganizing an old room that had been locked for years. Finding things he'd forgotten were there. Not sure yet whether to keep them or grieve them or simply let them be. I keep thinking about what he said to me, Harry said. In his office. Over the years. He turned the mug in his hands. He was always so reasonable. Always had an explanation. Always made everything feel inevitable. Like the shape of things was just the shape of things, and questioning it meant you were naive, or ungrateful, or not seeing the bigger picture. He paused. And now I'm looking at a document that says he bound a child's magic when she was 8 years old without her consent or anyone else's, and I keep trying to find the reasonable explanation, and I can't. There isn't one, Petunia said. No, Harry said. There really isn't. They sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was Sunday quiet, warm with the smell of the coffee she'd made him since she knew he didn't like tea as much as he drank it, and the folder of ministry memos lay open on the table between them like a door neither of them had entirely expected to walk through. He was good to me, Harry said carefully. Some of the time. The guidance he gave me, during the war, during everything with Voldemort, some of it was genuinely good. I wouldn't have survived without pieces of it. He looked up. I'm not pretending that wasn't real. No, Petunia said. Good people do terrible things. That's not a paradox, Harry. It's just the truth. He looked at her with something she couldn't quite name, attention, maybe, the particular quality of attention you give someone when they say something you weren't expecting and you want to hold on to it. The hearing, he said. Can I attend? Is that allowed? Rhea is looking into it, she said. You may be called as a witness regardless. Your placement with us, without a formal wardship application, without a magical child welfare review, that's one of the 15 grounds. Harry nodded slowly. Good, he said. The Algernon Wretch column was, Rhea said, exactly what they should have expected and exactly useful in its own way. He's made the argument for us, she told Petunia on Monday, in the narrow London office with its untamed wall of degrees. She had the profit column spread on her desk like evidence. He's saying that Muggle relatives of magical people shouldn't have standing to bring ICW complaints. Which is fascinating, because it implies that magical relatives should. And what Mrs. Dursley is, in fact, is a magically suppressed person, not a Muggle at all. He doesn't know that yet, Petunia said. He will, Rhea said. Everyone will. When the complaint is formally processed and the subject is notified, which has already happened, the nature of the grievance becomes part of the public record within 14 days. Dumbledore's legal team will know by end of this week. The press will know shortly after. She paused. His legal team, by the way, is Fairfax and Broad. That's the most senior magical law practice in Britain. Of course it is, Petunia said. What does that mean for us? It means they'll challenge standing first, Rhea said. Before they address a single substantive point. They'll argue that the complaint should be dismissed on procedural grounds before the panel ever looks at the evidence. She set the column aside. Which is why the 47 pages are 47 pages. I've preempted every procedural challenge I can think of and several I invented myself. Standing is airtight. The certificate is the document, it carries your magical signature, full stop, that's not arguable. What's their strongest ground for challenge? Petunia asked. Rhea was quiet for a moment. The consent question, she said. They'll argue that parental consent was implicit, that your parents knew, that Dumbledore informed them, that the absence of a formal petition was an administrative gap and not a deliberate omission. She met Petunia's eyes. Is there any possibility your parents knew? Petunia thought about her parents. About her father's particular kind of reverence for anything exceptional, the way he'd looked at Lily's first accidental magic, a neighbor's flower blooming out of season, everyone knowing it wasn't the season for roses, with a wonder he'd never quite looked at Petunia's school reports. About her mother, who'd loved both her daughters and managed, somehow, to make each of them feel it differently, as if love were a finite quantity that had to be rationed according to who needed it most at any given moment. My parents adored Lily, she said. They were proud of her in a way that, it took up a great deal of the room. I don't say that to be cruel. It was true. She paused. They also trusted institutions. My father especially. If Dumbledore had told them anything, they would have believed it. They would have consented to whatever he asked if he framed it correctly. She looked at Rhea. But there's no parental signature on the certificate. No, Rhea agreed. Which is notable in itself. He didn't tell them, Petunia said. He didn't need to. They would have asked questions, even if they ultimately agreed. He didn't want questions. She said it without heat. Just as observation. He wanted it clean. Rhea wrote something on her own legal pad. I'm going to request your parents' ministry records, she said. Any correspondence between them and Dumbledore or the ministry, any mention of you in Lily's registration documents. If he told them anything about you, anything at all, it will be on record. They're both dead, Petunia said. I know, Rhea said. I'm sorry. She paused. It doesn't affect what we can access. Records are records. Then access them, Petunia said. The letter from Fairfax and Broad arrived on Wednesday. It was, as Rhea had predicted, a standing challenge. 6 pages, dense with legal citations, written in the tone of people who had never in their professional lives doubted the outcome of anything they'd put their names to. They challenged Petunia's classification as a magical person, challenged the validity of the certificate as a founding document, challenged the ICW's jurisdiction over a matter they framed as a domestic British ministry issue, and requested that the complaint be dismissed prior to any hearing. Petunia read it at the kitchen table with a second cup of tea and then forwarded it to Rhea with a single line, "Thoughts?" Rhea called back in 20 minutes. "It's well drafted," she said, which Petunia had learned was Rhea's version of "they're good and I enjoy this." The jurisdiction argument is the most interesting one. They're saying the ICW doesn't have standing to review domestic ministerial authorizations. Do they have a point? Petunia asked. No, Rhea said. The Supreme Mugwump role is an international position. Its privileges are granted by and answerable to the Confederation, not the British ministry. That's the entire point of the role. They know this. They're making the argument anyway because it forces us to address it, which takes time and looks like we're scrambling. She paused. We're not scrambling. What are we doing? We're filing a response that addresses every point in 2 pages, Rhea said. Because if we match their 6 pages, we look defensive. 2 pages, clean citations, done. I want them to spend more time on their response than we spent on ours. Petunia found this deeply satisfying. Do it, she said. The response went in on Thursday. By Friday, the ICW Privileges Division had acknowledged receipt of both submissions and confirmed the hearing date, the 22nd of November. 8 weeks away. That same Friday afternoon, the Daily Prophet published the full nature of the complaint. The headline this time read, Dumbledore accused of illegally suppressing magical ability of Lily Potter's sister, Petunia Dursley was a witch. And this, unlike the first headline, did something the first one hadn't. It landed. Petunia knew it had landed because she had 3 missed calls from Dudley before 9 in the morning on Saturday, which was unprecedented in the history of their relationship. She rang him back and he answered on the first ring. Mum, he said. Mum, are you? Karen showed me the article. Are you? Is this real? Yes, she said. You're I have magical ability that was suppressed without my consent when I was 8 years old, she said. Whether that makes me a witch depends on what happens at the hearing, I suppose. The certificate is still active. A long silence. Can they undo it? She hadn't thought about that. Not in those specific terms. She'd been so focused on the complaint, on the process, on making the case, that she hadn't spent much time thinking about the after. About what it would mean to have it undone. To have access to something she'd never known she was missing. I don't know, she said honestly. Mom. Dudley's voice was doing something she hadn't heard it do since he was very small, before he'd learned the Dursley habit of converting emotion into bluster. He took that from you. Yes, she said. He stopped. She could hear him trying to find the right word and not quite managing. That's really not okay, he said finally, which was probably the understatement of the decade but also, somehow, exactly right. No, she said. It's really not okay. Which is why I'm doing something about it. Is there anything I can do? She thought about it. Karen, she said. Her last name is Whitmore, isn't it? Yeah, Dudley said, surprised. She's a junior reporter at the Magical Review, isn't she? I've been reading her bylines. A pause. Yeah, how did you? I pay attention, Dudley, Petunia said. Ask her if she'd like an exclusive interview. Before the hearing. I want to choose the publication that tells my version first, and I've been reading her work. Another pause. Much longer. You're kind of terrifying, Mum, Dudley said, with what sounded distinctly like pride. I'm decided, she said. There's a difference. The exclusive with Karen Whitmore ran 10 days before the hearing. It was 3,000 words, accompanied by a photograph Petunia had chosen herself, not the one the prophet had used without permission, a blurry shot from Harry's Hogwarts era, but a recent one, taken in her garden on an overcast morning, Petunia in a grey coat with her hands folded in front of her and her chin up. She looked, Harry told her, like someone who was about to win something. Karen Whitmore was a good interviewer. She asked direct questions and let the answers breathe. She didn't editorialize. She didn't let Petunia perform grief or dramatize her own story, because Petunia wasn't performing and didn't need to, the facts were dramatic enough on their own. The article began, Petunia Dursley has spent her adult life being described in relation to other people. Lily Potter's sister. Harry Potter's aunt. The muggle who answered the door. She is none of those things, or rather, she is all of them and also something else entirely, a woman whose magical ability was bound by Albus Dumbledore when she was 8 years old, who grew up believing herself to be ordinary, who raised her murdered sister's child within a framework of isolation and fear she now knows was architectured by the same man who took her magic, and who has decided, at 56, that the word ordinary has never once applied to her. Petunia read the opening paragraph and thought that Karen Whitmore was exactly as good as her byline suggested. The article went on to lay out the substance of the complaint with a precision that Petunia suspected came from Ria's background briefing. It described the suppression certificate, the legal breaches, the emergency clause, the 15 privileges under review. It quoted Petunia directly on the question of Harry's placement. He used the same authorization to put an orphan child in an unchecked household that he used to bind an 8-year-old girl. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's a pattern. The article did not quote Dumbledore. His office had declined to comment. It ran on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, it had been reprinted in full in 2 international wizarding publications. By Thursday, the ICW press office had issued a statement confirming the hearing date and the composition of the 5-person adjudicator panel. By Friday, Algernon Wretch had written a follow-up column that was 700 words longer than the first one and used the word hysterical 6 times, which Ria said meant they were winning the preliminary round. Amelia Bones came to see Petunia on the Saturday before the hearing. She arrived not by flu, Petunia had no flu connection, would never have one in this house, but by ministry car, which pulled up in front of number 4 with the sort of muggle-perfect discretion that suggested considerable magical effort. She was a solidly built woman in her mid-50s with a grey-streaked bun and the kind of bearing that came not from arrogance but from long familiarity with rooms that needed managing. She wore muggle clothes, a good wool coat, sensible shoes, and she carried nothing but a small leather folder. Petunia, who had been expecting her since underling that name 3 weeks ago, answered the door before she knocked. "Mrs. Dursley," Amelia Bones said. "I'm Amelia Bones," Petunia said. "Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Come in." If Amelia was surprised by this, she didn't show it. She stepped inside with the careful eyes of someone professionally trained to see a room. Petunia led her to the kitchen, made tea, and sat. "You didn't respond to the prophet's requests for comment," Petunia said. "No," Amelia said. "I don't comment on ongoing investigations to the prophet as a matter of policy." A pause. "I'm not here officially, Mrs. Dursley." "I know," Petunia said. "I'm here because I've read your complaint." Amelia set her folder on the table but didn't open it. "All 47 pages and the supplementary evidence packet. I've also read Cassius Vane's original audit findings. And the ministry memo file that your nephew submitted." She paused. "Your nephew is methodical." "He is," Petunia agreed. "I've known Albus Dumbledore for 30 years, Amelia said. "I'm telling you that because it's relevant to what I want to say. I have worked alongside him, deferred to his judgment in moments I now have cause to reconsider, and I considered him a man of genuine integrity." She looked at the folder. "I want to be clear that I'm not here to protect him. I'm here because the Department of Magical Law Enforcement has an interest in this hearing that is separate from my personal history with the subject." "You want to know if my complaint covers what I think it covers," Petunia said. Amelia looked at her. "I want to know if you understand the full scope of what you've opened." "Tell me what I've opened that I don't already know about," Petunia said. A pause. Amelia opened the folder. She slid a single page across the table, ministry letterhead, dense text, a reference number at the top that Petunia didn't recognize. "The emergency authorization clause," Amelia said, "has been used 15 times by Dumbledore. Your complaint addresses all 15. But 5 of those 15 involve actions that the Department of Magical Law Enforcement has been trying to formally review for the past 2 years and has been blocked from reviewing," she paused, "by Dumbledore himself, acting in his capacity as Chief Warlock." Petunia looked at the page. At the 5 reference numbers highlighted in the margin. "He used one position to protect the other," she said. "The Supreme Mugwump and the Chief Warlock," Amelia said. "Yes. When ICW oversight moved toward the authorization clause, he invoked Chief Warlock privilege to limit the scope of their inquiry. When the Wizengamot attempted to review his chief warlock decisions, he cited Supreme Mugwump's standing as context that the Wizengamot couldn't assess. He's been balancing them against each other for years. Like load-bearing walls, Petunia said. Amelia blinked. What? In construction, Petunia said. Two walls that hold each other up. Remove one and the other falls too. She paused. What does that mean for the hearing? It means, Amelia said carefully, that your complaint, as filed, against the Supreme Mugwump privileges, may trigger review of actions that were also taken under Chief Warlock authority. Actions the department has been trying to examine. If the hearing panel allows for expanded scope, does the panel have that authority? Under the Confederation's own procedural rules, Amelia said, yes. If evidence presented at a privileges hearing indicates systemic misuse across multiple positions, the panel can expand the scope of review within the same session. She looked at Petunia steadily. I want you to know that if that happens, the department will cooperate fully. We will provide any records the panel requests. Petunia looked at this woman who had admired Albus Dumbledore for 30 years and was sitting here anyway, sliding information across the table because she'd decided something was more important than comfortable loyalty. Why are you telling me this? Petunia asked. Amelia was quiet for a moment. Because you deserve to know what you're walking into, she said. And because, frankly, Mrs. Dursley, the case you've built is better than anything my department has managed in 2 years of trying. She paused. I don't want you going into that hearing room without the full picture. Does Rhea Thornwood know about this? Petunia asked. I'm meeting with her tomorrow, Amelia said. Good, Petunia said. She looked at the page, the 5 highlighted reference numbers, the 2-year investigation the department hadn't been able to complete, and she thought about load-bearing walls, and what happened when you understood the structure well enough to know exactly where to push. He's going to try to settle, she said. Before the hearing. Someone from his team will approach Rhea. Amelia said nothing for a moment. Then, that would be my expectation, yes. We won't, Petunia said. Settle. I want that on record, informally, so that when it comes up, and it will, no one wastes time waiting for me to change my mind. She folded her hands on the table. I didn't file 47 pages and 212 supporting documents because I wanted an apology and a letter. I filed because those 15 privileges need to be examined in public, by an authorized panel, on the record. Amelia looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her folder and stood. Mrs. Dursley, she said, I came here wondering if you understood what you'd started. I think perhaps I should have been wondering if he did. She showed herself out. Petunia stayed at the table for a while after the ministry car had gone, looking at the 5 highlighted reference numbers and the window and the garden and all the ordinary surfaces of a life that had been constructed around an absence, and she thought about Lily, who had never known, who had spent her life thinking Petunia simply hadn't had what she had, and had adapted to that difference in the way sisters do, with a mix of guilt and gratitude and the helpless love of people who can't change the distance between them. Lily hadn't known. Petunia was going to make it matter. Harry arrived on Sunday afternoon and she met him at the door and said, without preamble, the complaint may expand at the hearing to include Chief Warlock decisions. Amelia Bones told me yesterday. Harry stopped on the doorstep. She came here, he said. She came here, Petunia said. Come in. There's a lot to go over. He came in. She made coffee. She laid out everything Amelia had told her, and the 5 reference numbers, and Rhea's plan for the standing challenge response, and the interview in the magical review, and all of it, piece by piece, while Harry read and listened and occasionally asked questions that were sharp in the specific way that made her think he was very good at his job. At some point Vernon came in from the sitting room, looked at the table covered in legal pads and ministry memos and wizarding newspaper clippings, and said, with the tone of a man who has decided to let something be larger than his comfort zone, either of you want sandwiches? Harry looked up, slightly startled. Yeah, he said. That'd be great. Thanks, Uncle Vernon. Vernon made sandwiches. He made 4, 2 for Harry and 2 for Petunia, and he brought them to the table and put them down and went back to the sitting room without comment, which was, Petunia thought, the most dignified thing she'd seen him do in years. She and Harry worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Outside, the November dark came early and the house filled with the low light of reading lamps and the smell of coffee going cold and the quiet specific industry of 2 people building something careful and deliberate out of everything that had been taken from them. The hearing was 7 days away. She was ready. Chapter 3, The room where it happens. The ICW regional headquarters in London was not where Petunia had expected it to be. She'd imagined something hidden, some twist of magical geography that would require knowing the right words or tapping a specific brick or walking through a wall. Instead it was on a perfectly ordinary street in Holborn, occupying what looked from the outside like a converted Victorian courthouse, which, Rhea explained during the taxi ride over, it was, because the ICW had purchased it in 1923 from the British government and simply neglected to tell anyone. The exterior was grey stone. The steps were worn smooth in the center from a century of foot traffic, and the 2 witches flanking the main entrance in formal navy robes looked, at first glance, like unusually well-dressed security guards. Harry was already on the steps when the taxi pulled up. He'd come in Muggle clothes, dark trousers, a good jacket, no robes, which was either a strategic choice or his default, Petunia wasn't sure, and he had the focused, slightly tight expression he got when he was managing the difference between how calm he appeared and how he actually felt. "How are you?" he said, when she reached the steps. "Ready," she said. She was wearing a charcoal suit she'd bought specifically for this, and the good shoes, and her hair was neat. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had been preparing for this for weeks and was not afraid of the room. "Rhea's already inside," Harry said. "Cassius Vane is here too." The panel asked him to be available as a technical witness for the audit findings. "Good," Petunia said. "There are press," he said, with a slight note of warning. "Quite a few." "I saw them," she said. She'd clocked them from the taxi, a cluster of people on the far side of the street with notebooks and quick quotes quills hovering at the ready, 2 photographers, and 1 person she recognized from her reading as the Daily Prophet's senior court correspondent. She'd walked past them without looking over. "Let's go in." The inside of the building was more impressive than the outside, which she suspected was intentional, the exterior designed to be dismissible, the interior designed to land. The entrance hall had a ceiling that was either very high or magically extended, she couldn't tell, and the walls were lined with carved wooden panels depicting scenes she didn't recognize and didn't stop to examine. The floor was cold stone. The acoustics made every footstep deliberate. A clerk in navy robes met them and led them through a set of double doors and down a corridor that smelled of old wood and something faintly herbal, and then through another set of doors into the hearing room itself. It was smaller than she'd expected. Not a great vaulted chamber, just a large, well-appointed room with high windows on the north wall that let in the grey November light, a long table at the far end where the 5-person adjudicator panel would sit, a witness stand to the left, and 2 tables facing the panel, one for the complainant and one for the subject. The gallery along the sides held perhaps 40 seats, and they were already filling. Rhea was at the complainant's table, arranging papers with the organized efficiency of someone who'd done this many times and found comfort in precision. She looked up when Petunia came in and said, "Good morning. How was the traffic?" "Fine," Petunia said, sitting. "Fairfax and Broad arrived 20 minutes ago," Rhea said, without changing her tone. 2 senior partners and an associate. "They've been reviewing something at their table for the last quarter hour, which means they received something this morning they weren't expecting. I'd guess Amelia Bone's department sent supplementary records overnight." Petunia glanced at the subject's table. 3 men in robes, silver-haired, with the compact, tightly managed body language of lawyers who charged by the quarter hour and expected to win. They were not, notably, looking at the complainant's table, which meant they were very deliberately not looking at it. "Where's Dumbledore?" Harry asked, settling into the gallery seat directly behind the complainant's table. Not here yet, Rhea said. His team arrived first. I don't know if that's strategic or, look. The double doors at the back of the room opened. Albus Dumbledore walked in. He was, Petunia thought, exactly what he'd always been, a very tall man who occupied space with the unconscious certainty of someone who had never once been asked to make himself smaller. He was in robes tonight, deep blue, formal, with none of the usual whimsy she'd seen in photographs. His white beard was neatly kept. His half-moon glasses caught the grey light. He moved through the room with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had attended many important rooms and found them all, ultimately, manageable. He looked at the complainant's table. Petunia looked back. She'd wondered how she'd feel, seeing him in person for the first time in 45 years, she calculated, since the night he'd left Harry on her doorstep in the dark and walked away. She'd wondered if she'd feel anything dramatic, some surge of years-held emotion that would need managing. Instead, what she felt was clear. Focused. The specific clean certainty of someone who has done the preparation and is ready to use it. Dumbledore's gaze moved from her to Harry, behind her, and something shifted in his expression, not guilt, exactly, not discomfort, something more complex than either. Something that knew what it was looking at. Harry met his gaze and didn't look away. Dumbledore turned to his table. The 5 adjudicators filed in at 9 o'clock precisely, which struck Petunia as the right way to start something that was supposed to be about whether the rules meant anything. The chief adjudicator was a woman named Isolde Ferreira, Portuguese, who occupied the center seat with the comfortable authority of someone who'd run enough hearings to find the room's dynamics manageable before they started. She was perhaps 60, with sharp dark eyes and the specific efficiency of movement that meant she would not be tolerating anything she found wasteful. The 4 panel members flanking her were from 4 different countries, France, South Africa, Canada, and Japan, which Rhea had told Petunia was deliberate, a structural safeguard against any single nation's political interests dominating the panel. This session is convened pursuant to ICW Regulation 14, Article 7, Ferreira said, without preamble, regarding the formal review of operational privileges held by the Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. The complainant is Mrs. Petunia Dursley. The subject is Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, currently serving as Supreme Mugwump, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot and Headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. She set her papers down. Before we proceed to substantive matters, there are 2 preliminary issues to address. The first is the standing challenge filed by the subject's legal representatives. The second is a scope application filed by the complainant's legal representative yesterday morning. A small ripple of movement through the gallery at that second point. Petunia had felt Rhea's decision to file the scope application, which formalized the request for expanded review if the panel found grounds, was a clean preemptive move. Better to have it already in front of the panel than to raise it mid-hearing and look reactive. We'll address standing first, Ferreira said. Mr. Castleton? The senior Fairfax and Broad partner, Castleton, she'd remembered the name, rose. He was a careful speaker, measured, and he laid out the standing challenge with the efficient confidence of someone who'd given versions of this argument many times. The complainant was a Muggle national. The certificate, he argued, while bearing her signature, could not in itself establish magical status absent a formal ministry determination. The complaint, therefore, lacked the foundational standing requirement for a privileges hearing, which required the complainant to be a person directly affected in their magical capacity. He sat. Rhea rose. The certificate, she said, is a suppression certificate. A document that can only be issued against a person who has magical capacity. The document itself, bearing Mrs. Dursley's magical signature, is the proof of status. To argue that she lacks standing because she has not been formally recognized as a magical person is to argue that the illegal act used to deny her that recognition should now be used to deny her legal remedy. That is, with respect to my learned colleague, a circular argument that the panel should decline to follow. She paused. The ICW's own precedent, specifically the Marchetti Determination of 1987, established that magical signature evidence is sufficient to establish status for the purposes of privileges hearings. I have included the full citation in the evidence packet. She sat. Ferreira conferred briefly with the panel member to her left, a low exchange Petunia couldn't hear. Then she said, "The panel accepts the complainant standing. The Marchetti precedent is applicable. Standing challenge is dismissed." Castleton's expression didn't change. But the associate beside him wrote something on a notepad with slightly more force than was strictly necessary. Rhea, beside Petunia, made a small notation in her own margin. "Not celebrating. Just recording." Castleton rose again. His objection to the scope application was longer, more layered, and it was here that Petunia could see the real quality of his preparation. He argued that expanding scope mid-hearing was procedurally irregular, that the subject had been notified of specific privilege challenges and had prepared his response accordingly, and that any expansion would constitute a procedural violation of the subject's right to adequate notice. He sat. Rhea rose. "The complainant's scope application does not request immediate expansion," Rhea said. "It requests that the panel reserve the right to expand if the evidence warrants. This is a standard procedural protection that the panel already holds under Regulation 14, Article 9. The application is not requesting anything the panel doesn't already have the authority to do. It is simply formalizing that authority in the record so that any future expansion cannot be challenged as irregular." She paused. "The subject was notified of the application yesterday morning. He has had 24 hours to add any supplementary response documents to his brief, which I note his team has done. I count 3 new pages in their submission this morning." Castleton's jaw tightened, slightly. Ferreira said, "The scope application is noted and held in reserve. The panel retains the right to expand review if warranted. We will not anticipate that decision at this stage." She set another page aside. "Mrs. Thornwood, the complainant's case may proceed." Rhea opened with the certificate. She didn't dramatize it. She simply laid out the document, its date, its legal requirements, and the specific ways in which each requirement had not been met, with the precise, unhurried pace of someone who knows the evidence doesn't need embellishment. She took 20 minutes. When she finished, the certificate had been entered into evidence, and 5 adjudicators had read it in full, and the room was quiet in the way that specific kind of quiet is when everyone in it is thinking the same thing and no one said it yet. Then she said, "The complainant will take the stand." Petunia walked from the table to the witness stand. The room was small enough that it wasn't much of a walk, but she felt the quality of attention shift as she stood. 40 people in the gallery. 5 adjudicators. 3 lawyers who were going to try very hard to make her doubt herself. And Albus Dumbledore, at the other table, watching her with an expression of careful, composed attentiveness that might have passed for concern. She stood at the witness stand and looked at the panel and waited. "Mrs. Dursley," Rhea said. "When did you first become aware of the suppression certificate bearing your signature?" 7 weeks ago, Petunia said. A Mr. Cassius Vane from the ICW Audit Division contacted me by letter and requested a meeting. At that meeting, he showed me the certificate for the first time. Prior to that meeting, did you have any knowledge that your magical capacity had been suppressed? No. Did you have any memory of giving consent, at any age, to any form of magical suppression? No. Did anyone, parent, guardian, teacher, or otherwise, ever indicate to you that you possessed magical ability? The opposite, Petunia said. I was told consistently that I did not. I believed that completely. I had no reason not to. Rhea moved through her questions steadily, each one building on the last, each answer adding one more brick to the evidentiary wall she was constructing. Petunia answered directly, without elaboration she hadn't been asked for, without emotion she didn't actually feel in the moment. She was not performing stoicism. She was simply not overwhelmed by a room she had spent weeks preparing to stand in. "I'd like to ask you about a specific sequence," Rhea said. "You applied to attend Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry at the age of 11, is that correct?" "Yes." "And you received a response from Albus Dumbledore?" "I did." "Can you summarize that response?" "He told me that I did not have magical ability and could not attend Hogwarts," Petunia said. "He was kind about it. He said something about finding my own remarkable path." She paused. "I kept the letter for a long time. I eventually threw it away. And yet, according to the certificate, which is dated 3 years prior to your Hogwarts application, your magical capacity had already been suppressed when you wrote that letter." "Yes," Petunia said. "He wrote to tell me I had no magic. He had made sure of that 3 years earlier." Silence. Rhea said, "I have no further questions for this witness at this time. I'll invite the panel to proceed." Ferreira looked at the subjects table. "Mr. Castleton, your cross-examination." Castleton rose. He straightened his robes, a small preparatory gesture, and approached the witness stand with the careful air of a man who has decided that his best strategy is thoroughness and patience. "Mrs. Dursley," he said. "You've testified that you had no knowledge of this certificate prior to 7 weeks ago." "That's correct." "Is it possible that you were informed of its existence as a child, and simply have no memory of it?" "At 8 years old," Petunia said, "I had no memory of signing it. If I'd been informed of it, the reasonable expectation would be that I'd remember the conversation. I remember a great deal from when I was 8. "But you can't definitively rule it out," Castleton said. "I can't definitively rule out anything that would have required me to remember a conversation that had no effect on my daily life," Petunia said. "I can tell you that nothing in my childhood experience suggested I had magical ability that had been deliberately removed. If someone had told me that when I was 8, I believe I would have found it extremely memorable." A small sound from the gallery. "Not laughter exactly, more like recognition." Castleton moved on. "You've described applying to Hogwarts at age 11. Are you aware that the standard assessment for magical ability at Hogwarts operates independently of the suppression mechanism?" "I'm not an expert on the mechanism," Petunia said. "You'd need to ask someone with technical qualifications. What I know is that the certificate suppressed my magical capacity. The assessment at Hogwarts would presumably have assessed what my capacity was at the time of assessment, which was suppressed. My question is whether you understand that the mechanism, Mr. Castleton," Petunia said, "I understand that you're trying to establish technical ambiguity around the question of whether I would have been accepted to Hogwarts even without the suppression. I can't answer that question. What I can tell you is that the legal question before this panel is not whether I would have been a great witch. It's whether Albus Dumbledore had the legal authority to bind my magical capacity without my consent or proper authorization when I was 8 years old. And on that question, the certificate speaks for itself." Castleton paused. "Just briefly." "I see," he said. "Let me move to a different matter. You've stated that Mr. Dumbledore placed your nephew, Harry Potter, in your household using the same emergency authorization clause. Is it your position that this placement was harmful?" "Harry lived in a cupboard under my stairs for the first several years of his life," Petunia said. The room went very still. "Mrs. Dursley, he had a bedroom eventually," she said. "But the cupboard came first. He was made to feel, consistently and deliberately, that he was a burden and an inconvenience in that house. He was told his parents died in a car crash. He was given his cousin's cast-offs and his cousin's second bedroom when his cousin ran out of room for his toys. That is what happened in the household that Albus Dumbledore placed him in without a wardship application or a magical child welfare review." She looked at Castleton steadily. "Was it harmful?" "I was inside it. You're asking me to assess my own choices and I will not pretend they were good ones. But yes, the structure was harmful. The isolation was harmful. The framework was harmful. And I did not build the framework. Castleton stood very still for a moment. I have no further questions, he said. He walked back to his table. They recessed for lunch at 12:30. Rhea took Petunia to a small side room, a kind of antechamber with a table and chairs and a window looking out on a grey courtyard, and they sat and Rhea poured water and said nothing for a moment. How are you feeling? Rhea asked. Fine, Petunia said. That was, Rhea paused. The cupboard answer. I know, Petunia said. It wasn't in my prepared responses. No, Rhea agreed. But it was true. And it was specific. And specific truth in a privileges hearing is worth 30 pages of legal analysis. She paused. Castleton retreated. Which means they didn't have a follow-up ready, which means they weren't expecting you to say it. He was expecting me to be defensive, Petunia said. To justify myself. To explain how the arrangement was well-intentioned. And you didn't. No, Petunia said. Because it wasn't. Harry came in with a paper bag, sandwiches, again, which seemed to have become the logistical through-line of this whole process, and set them on the table and sat beside Petunia and said, the gallery's talking. I heard someone say the Castleton Cross was a disaster. For them, yes, Rhea said mildly, unwrapping a sandwich. What happens this afternoon? Harry asked. The subject's opening statement, Rhea said. Followed by Dumbledore taking the stand. Either Castleton handles examination, in which case they're keeping Dumbledore managed, or Dumbledore handles it himself, in which case, she considered, they think he's their best witness. He usually is, Harry said. Petunia looked at him. You know his speaking manner. I've sat in his office more times than I can count, Harry said. He said it without bitterness but also without fondness, which was its own kind of accuracy. He's very good at seeming like the most reasonable person in the room. At making you feel like any concern you have is something he's already thought of and already resolved. Like the conversation is one he's had many times and finds gentle but unnecessary. Petunia thought about his letter to her. 800 words of warmth and regret and certainty, written to an 11-year-old girl who'd asked to come to a school he'd already ensured she was barred from attending. Then we need to make sure the panel has the evidence in front of them before he speaks, she said. So they're not hearing him fresh. They're hearing him in context. Rhea had already anticipated this. The evidence packet, all 212 pages of it, had been provided to each panel member that morning. Ferreira had confirmed all 5 members had reviewed the certificate and the statutory analysis before the session opened. When the recess ended and they walked back into the hearing room, the afternoon light had shifted, the grey northern windows now casting a cooler, flatter light across the panel table. Petunia took her seat and watched Dumbledore settle at his table and adjust his papers, and she thought about frameworks. About load-bearing walls. About the particular confidence of a man who had spent decades building structures around other people without ever imagining that someone would learn to read the architecture. This afternoon session will begin with the subject's statement, Ferreira said. Mr. Dumbledore, the floor is yours. Dumbledore rose. He had the room the moment he stood. That was the honest truth of it, he had the room, and Petunia watched it happen with clear eyes and acknowledged it without alarm. He was 80 or 90 or however old he was, and he stood like someone who had inhabited authority for so long it had become structural, part of his skeleton. He adjusted his half-moon glasses and looked at the panel and he began to speak. Chief Adjudicator Ferreira, he said. Panel members. I want to begin by saying something that my legal representatives may find imprudent. He paused, in the specific way of someone who has timed the pause. I am genuinely sorry that Mrs. Dursley is here. Not sorry in the way of a man who wishes he hadn't been caught, I want to be clear about that, but sorry in the way of a man who takes no pleasure in the pain of anyone, least of all the family of a woman I cared for very much. Lily, Petunia thought. He was invoking Lily in his first sentence. My decisions with respect to the Evans-Dursley family were made in extraordinary circumstances, Dumbledore continued, during and following one of the darkest periods in wizarding history. The choices available to me were not good choices on one side and poor choices on the other. They were series of difficult decisions made under conditions of genuine urgency, in which every option carried cost. He looked at the certificate. The suppression certificate is not something I would defend as a good decision. It was a decision I made in 1965 because I believed, at that time, that an uncontrolled magical manifestation in a Muggle household, by a child showing early signs of volatile accidental magic, posed a genuine and proximate risk. There is no danger assessment on file, Ferreira said, calmly. No, Dumbledore said. There is not. And that is an administrative failure for which I take full responsibility. The documentation should have been created and filed. It was not. I cannot give a satisfactory account of why it was not, except to say that the period in question was one of considerable pressure, and the documentary requirements were insufficiently attended to. There are also no quarterly review records, Ferreira said. Also an administrative failure, Dumbledore said, without hesitation. Petunia watched the panel members' faces. Watched Ferreira's expression, not hostile, not convinced, just watching. Ferreira was the kind of person, Petunia had decided, who didn't decide anything until she'd heard everything. Which was exactly right. Which was the only correct way to run a room. The emergency authorization clause, Dumbledore continued, was designed for situations precisely like the one I faced in 1965. A child with uncontrolled magical ability, in a Muggle household, without the framework to manage it safely. The suppression was intended to be temporary, a stabilizing measure until appropriate support could be arranged. The certificate ran for 60 years, said the Canadian panel member, a compact woman named Adjudicator LeBlanc, without inflection. Dumbledore paused. Yes, he said. That is the most difficult aspect of this to account for, and I won't pretend otherwise. A temporary measure that became permanent through a combination of circumstance, oversight, and, I will be honest, the pressure of subsequent events which commanded attention of a more immediately urgent nature. He meant Voldemort, Petunia understood. He was explaining 60 years of her suppressed existence as a casualty of more important business. She sat very still and said nothing. What I would ask this panel to consider, Dumbledore said, is the context. Not as a justification, I am not here to justify what is, by any fair assessment, a serious failing. But as context. The world in which these decisions were made was not a safe one. The protections I built around the Potter family, including the arrangements involving Mrs. Dursley's household, were motivated entirely by the desire to keep Harry Potter alive. Which he is. He paused. I do not believe it is irrelevant that he is alive. The room was quiet. Harry, behind Petunia, said nothing. She could feel him not saying it, the particular quality of his stillness. That's all I have to say by way of statement, Dumbledore said. I'm happy to answer questions from the panel or from Mrs. Thornwood. He sat. Ferreira said, Thank you, Mr. Dumbledore. A pause. Mrs. Thornwood, you may cross-examine. Rhea rose. She had a single page of notes and she barely looked at it. Mr. Dumbledore, she said. You've described the 1965 suppression certificate as a response to volatile accidental magic in a Muggle household. Can you name the specific incidents of accidental magic that prompted your decision? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. As I mentioned, the documentation was, I'm not asking for documentation, Rhea said pleasantly. I'm asking if you can recall, from your own memory, the specific incidents. A date, an event, a description. Anything. A pause. It was some time ago, he said. I cannot recall with specificity. Can you recall generally? There were reports, he said. I received reports. From whom? Another pause. Slightly longer. I believe from the school, from Hogwarts. During Lily Evans' first year. Concerning the family. Lily Evans enrolled at Hogwarts in September 1971, Rhea said. The certificate is dated 1965. 6 years prior to Lily's enrollment. Silence. Mr. Dumbledore, Rhea said. Is it possible that there were no reported incidents of dangerous accidental magic, and that the emergency authorization clause was applied in the absence of the emergency it requires? Dumbledore looked at her. He looked at her with the steady, careful attention of a man in the process of recalculating and finding the terrain less certain than he'd mapped it. As I said, Mrs. Thornwood, he said quietly, the documentation was insufficient. That's not an answer to my question, Rhea said. He was quiet for a moment. In the gallery, nothing moved. No, he said finally. I cannot demonstrate that there were specific documented incidents. Rhea made a note. Let me ask you about the Harry Potter placement, she said. You placed Harry Potter in Mrs. Dursley's household in November 1981, using the emergency authorization clause. Is that correct? Yes. Without a wardship application. The blood protection, that's not what I asked, Rhea said. Without a wardship application. Yes or no? Yes, Dumbledore said. Without a magical child welfare review. The urgency, yes or no? Yes, Dumbledore said. So you placed a 15-month-old child in an unchecked household, a household headed by a woman whose suppression you had arranged, whose husband you had briefed with a specific story designed to produce hostility toward the child, and with no subsequent welfare oversight, using the same emergency clause you had used 16 years earlier to bind that same woman's magic. Castleton said, objection, compound, I'll take them one at a time, Rhea said pleasantly. Did you brief Vernon Dursley? Dumbledore looked at his hands. I spoke with Mr. Dursley, yes. What did you tell him? I told him that the magical environment Harry came from was significant, and that limiting Harry's magical exposure would be beneficial. Did you tell him that his wife was medically fragile and that too much magical exposure could harm her? Silence. Mr. Dumbledore. I may have framed it in those terms, Dumbledore said, and for the first time in the session, the sentence was less than it should have been, came up short of itself, missed the confident landing. You told a man that magic could hurt his wife, Rhea said, knowing that his wife's magical suppression was entirely your doing, and knowing that this framing would produce a household dynamic significantly shaped by fear and hostility toward the magical child you just placed in it. I was trying to protect the child, Dumbledore said. You were trying to protect the blood ward, Rhea said. The protection that required Harry Potter to experience the Dursley house as home. Which required the Dursleys to treat him as belonging there. Which required a specific emotional dynamic that you engineered by telling Vernon Dursley his wife was fragile. She paused. You needed Harry miserable enough to stay, and you manufactured the conditions for it. The room had gone absolutely still. Dumbledore said, that is not, and then stopped. That is not what? Rhea asked. He looked at the panel. Then at Petunia. It was the longest look he'd given her since the session began. And for the first time, she saw something in it that wasn't composure or careful management. Something older than that and more honest. She looked back and didn't soften. I think, Dumbledore said, very quietly, that I believed I was protecting everyone. I know you did, Rhea said. My client is not asking the panel to find that your intentions were malicious, Mr. Dumbledore. She is asking the panel to find that your authority was used beyond its legal scope, that the protections built into the law were bypassed, that real harm was caused to real people, and that the 15 privileges that derive from the same clause should be reviewed and assessed on those grounds. She looked at the panel. I have no further questions. She sat. The room was still. Ferreira let it be still for a moment, which felt like a deliberate choice. Then she said, the panel will take a short recess before hearing from the technical audit witness. People moved. The gallery broke into the low, urgent murmur of a crowd that has just watched something shift. Petunia turned slightly and found Harry looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, not triumph, not grief, somewhere more complex. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," he said. "And then, you?" She thought about it for a real moment. "I think so," she said. "Ask me again at the end." Cassius Vane was straightening his papers at the witness table, preparing for his testimony, with the quiet focused air of someone who had done the right thing 3 weeks ago and was here to finish it. He looked up and caught her eye and gave a small nod. "Not theatrical. Just present." She nodded back. Outside, the gray November sky was darkening early, the afternoon pulling toward evening through the high north windows, and in the ICW hearing room in a converted Victorian courthouse on a Holborn Street, the first day of the hearing that Petunia Dursley had spent 7 weeks building was doing precisely what she'd built it to do. Holding its weight. Chapter 4, 15 Cassius Vane was not a dramatic man. He'd told Petunia as much, in the kitchen 3 weeks ago, when he'd asked how she wanted the audit findings presented and she'd said clearly and in order, and he'd said that suits me perfectly. He had the specific quality of competence that didn't need to announce itself, the kind you noticed only in the gap between what he said and how precisely it landed. He took the witness stand at 2:30 with his satchel, from which he produced a slim folder of exactly 12 pages, and he began to speak in the measured, technical manner of someone who had organized his material the way a good engineer organized a load plan, every element in the right place, bearing exactly the weight it needed to bear and none that it didn't. Rhea led him through the audit findings. He walked the panel through the certificate's structural components, explaining each legal requirement in terms that were clear without being condescending, the consent signature, the danger assessment, the Wiesengemot seal, the quarterly review obligation, and for each requirement, he produced the corresponding absence. Not the absence of records that might have been lost. The absence of records that should have generated trails, cross-references, departmental notifications, and hadn't. When a suppression certificate is lawfully issued, Cassius said, it creates, automatically, a chain of administrative records. The issuing authority receives a confirmation. The ministry's magical persons register is updated. The bound individual's record is flagged for quarterly welfare review by the Magical Persons Oversight Office. These records are not filed by hand, they're generated by the certification process itself. He turned to the 3rd page of his folder. In this case, none of those secondary records exist. Not in degraded form. Not as lost records with reference numbers and no attached content. They simply do not exist. The certificate was issued outside the standard certification process entirely. What does that tell you? Rhea asked. That the certificate was generated manually, Cassius said. By someone with the technical knowledge to produce a valid-looking document without going through the administrative process that would have created the oversight trail. He paused. It is, technically, a forgery. A very sophisticated one, produced by someone who understood the system well enough to replicate the surface while bypassing the substance. The word forgery settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Clean entry, significant spread. Castleton rose. The witness is characterizing an audit finding, Ferreira said. Sit down, Mr. Castleton. He sat. Rhea said, Mr. Vane, in the course of your audit, did you identify other certificates or authorizations bearing similar characteristics, issued without the administrative trail they should have generated? Yes, Cassius said. 5 others. All issued under the Emergency Authorization Clause. The full list is in the supplementary evidence packet, pages 147 through 163. And the total number of Emergency Clause authorizations you identified as legally irregular? 15, Cassius said. The number landed the same way it had landed in Ria's office 3 weeks ago and in Petunia's kitchen before that, flat, factual, and heavy with everything it implied. 15 separate occasions on which the same mechanism had been used with the same disregard for the legal scaffolding that mechanism required. Ferreira said, "Mr. Castleton, cross-examination." Castleton rose with the carefully composed expression of someone who had watched the last 40 minutes go badly and was managing his remaining resources. He approached Cassius with the specific neutrality of a lawyer who has decided his best strategy is to find the single thread worth pulling. "Mr. Vane," he said. "You've described the certificate as generated outside the standard process. Is it possible that the process itself operated differently in 1965? That the administrative trail you're describing as absent was not a requirement at the time?" Cassius looked at him. The Magical Persons Autonomy Act, which established the quarterly review requirement, was enacted in 1952. The administrative process that generates the oversight trail was established simultaneously. The certificate is dated 1965, 13 years after those requirements were in force. He paused. "No. Could records from that period have been lost or damaged?" "The 5 other irregular certificates I identified span dates from 1965 to 1991, Cassius said. "Records from all of those years exist in abundance in the same archive. The specific records that should have been generated by those 15 authorizations are absent while all surrounding records are intact. A loss or damage event that selectively removed only those records while leaving everything else would be, statistically remarkable." "Statistically remarkable," Castleton repeated. "Yes," Cassius said pleasantly. Castleton sat. Ferreira looked at her panel members and said, "The panel will hear from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Is the representative present?" Amelia Bones rose from the gallery, not the witness stand, Petunia noted, the gallery, meaning she'd been sitting there for the entire session watching, and walked to the stand with the particular walk of someone who has made a decision and is done revising it. "Adjudicator Ferreira," she said. "I'm appearing in my capacity as head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement to provide relevant context regarding the department's attempts to review 5 of the 15 authorizations currently under examination." She settled. "I'll be brief." She was 8 minutes, precise, with dates and reference numbers and the names of the ministry officials who had requested oversight reviews and the dates on which those requests had been declined or deferred or simply not responded to. She described the mechanism by which the Chief Warlock position had been used to limit the scope of ICW inquiry and the Supreme Mugwump position had been used to limit Weisengamot review, the two authorities cycling through each other like a closed loop. When she finished, Ferreira said, "Does the Department of Magical Law Enforcement have a formal position on the scope application filed by the complainant?" "The department supports expanded scope review," Amelia said, "if the panel finds grounds." "Thank you," Ferreira said. "Mr. Dumbledore's team will have the opportunity to respond tomorrow morning. We'll recess for today at, Chief Adjudicator." The voice came from the complainant's table. "Ria's." She was already standing. "My apologies for the interruption," Ria said, "but the complainant has one additional witness she would like to request be heard today, given that the witness's testimony directly supports the evidence just provided by the DMLE representative. The witness is present in the gallery." Ferreira looked at Castleton, who looked like he'd already known this was coming and hadn't found a way to prevent it. "Mr. Castleton, objection?" Castleton said, "On the grounds of inadequate notice, the witness was listed in the complainant's evidence packet," Ria said. Page 3. Listed as a potential witness pending panel scheduling. The subject's team has had the evidence packet for 3 weeks. A pause. Ferreira said, "The witness may be heard." "Who are we calling?" "Professor Minerva McGonagall," Ria said. "Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." Minerva McGonagall was 71 years old and walked like someone who had been walking into difficult rooms their entire life and found the difficulty bracing rather than deterring. She was in formal tartan robes, her hair in its customary severe bun, and she carried herself with the compressed authority of someone who had spent decades being the most no-nonsense person in any given building. She sat at the witness stand and looked at the panel and then, briefly, at Dumbledore. It was a long look. Not hostile. Not warm. The look of a woman who had something difficult to do and had decided to do it properly. Petunia watched it happen and thought, she didn't want to be here. She came anyway. Rhea approached. "Professor McGonagall," she said. "How long have you worked alongside Albus Dumbledore?" 40 years, McGonagall said. "I joined the Hogwarts staff in 1956. He became headmaster in 1970. And you would describe your working relationship as close," McGonagall said. "I have regarded him, for most of that time, as a mentor. A colleague of exceptional ability. A man whose judgment I trusted." "Trusted," Rhea noted. The past tense, without comment. "I reviewed your complaint," McGonagall said, without being asked. She looked at Petunia for the first time. "When I was asked to consider providing testimony, I reviewed the full complaint. The certificate. The supplementary evidence." She paused. "I want to say, before I answer any questions, that I find what was done to Mrs. Dursley indefensible. I want that on record." "Noted," Ferreira said. Rhea said, "Professor McGonagall, were you involved in or aware of the arrangements made for Harry Potter following his parents' deaths in 1981? "I was partially aware," McGonagall said. "I was told that Harry would be placed with his mother's sister. I was not told that the placement was being made under the emergency authorization clause rather than through a formal wardship process." "Did you raise concerns about the placement?" McGonagall's jaw tightened slightly. "I observed Privet Drive for a full day before the placement was made," she said. "I had significant reservations. I communicated them to Albus." She paused. He heard them and proceeded regardless. "What were your reservations?" "That the Dursley family was not, in my assessment, a suitable environment for the child," she said. "That Mrs. Dursley had complicated feelings about the wizarding world, and about her sister. That placing Harry there carried real risks to his well-being." Another pause. Albus explained the blood protection. He explained that the connection to Lily's sacrifice required a blood relative. He made it sound necessary. Inevitable. "Did he tell you about Mrs. Dursley's suppression?" Rhea asked. A silence. "No," McGonagall said. "He did not." "If he had," Rhea said, "would your assessment of the placement have changed?" McGonagall was quiet for a moment. That was not hesitation, it was the specific stillness of someone giving a question the honesty it deserved. "Yes," she said. Categorically. A household headed by a woman whose own magical identity had been suppressed without her knowledge, in a manner designed by the man placing the child, yes. That would have changed everything. "Did it change anything for you when you learned of it?" "Obviously," McGonagall said, and it was the first time in her testimony that the word carried any heat. Not anger at Rhea. Not anger at the question. Something older and more inward. Rhea said, "Professor McGonagall, I want to ask you about a specific document." She turned to her evidence packet and produced a page. "This is an internal Hogwarts memorandum, dated September 1991, written by you to Albus Dumbledore following Harry Potter's first week at the school." McGonagall looked at the page. Her expression didn't change, but something in the set of her shoulders did. "In this memo," Rhea said, "you wrote, and I'm quoting directly, the boy shows signs consistent with prolonged emotional neglect. He is unaccustomed to positive attention and appears to expect correction rather than praise. I am concerned that his home environment has been significantly more hostile than we anticipated. I would request that we revisit the suitability of his current guardianship arrangement before next summer." "Is that your writing?" "Yes," McGonagall said. "And what was Albus Dumbledore's response?" McGonagall looked at the panel. He thanked me for my concern, she said, and told me that the arrangement needed to remain in place for Harry's protection, and that the discomfort of the home environment was, regrettably, part of what made the blood ward function. The room absorbed this. He told you the home environment needed to be hostile, Rhea said, for the ward to work. He told me the connection required was emotional, McGonagall said. That Harry needed to experience the household as home. He didn't use the word hostile. A pause. But I understood his meaning. And she stopped. Professor? I accepted it, she said quietly. I wrote the memo. He responded. I accepted his response and did not escalate. She looked directly at Petunia. That was wrong. I have thought about it for 14 years and I know it was wrong and there is no word that covers it adequately. Petunia looked back at her. The woman who had watched her put the sandwiches away in the kitchen the morning after her sister died, who had stood on the pavement and called them hard, who had been there at the beginning of all of it and carried it for 40 years and was here now, in this room, saying it plainly. She nodded once. Small. Not absolution. Acknowledgement. McGonagall looked away. I have no further questions, Rhea said. Castleton had 3. He made them brief and technical and none of them touched anything McGonagall had said that mattered. She answered each one precisely and was excused, and she walked back through the gallery and took a seat 3 rows from the door, and Petunia did not watch her go. The panel deliberated through the evening. Petunia, Harry, and Rhea sat in the antechamber with cold tea and the remains of sandwiches and the specific suspended quality of people who have done everything that can be done and are now waiting for events they can't influence. Harry had his elbows on the table and was looking at nothing in particular with the focused distraction of someone running through things. Rhea was reviewing notes she probably didn't need to review. Petunia sat with her hands folded and the patience she'd built over years of managing things quietly and not rushing to fill silences. McGonagall's testimony, Harry said eventually. Was that expected? I knew she would be honest, Rhea said. I hoped the memo existed. I found it in the Hogwarts Internal Records Archive 3 days ago. I didn't know until this morning whether she'd confirm it was hers or try to contextualize it differently. She didn't contextualize it, Harry said. No, Rhea agreed. She didn't. Harry was quiet for a moment. She wrote it when I was 11, he said. And he told her to leave it. Yes, Rhea said. The word sat there, small and factual and carrying a great deal. Petunia thought about the summer Harry was 11. About the letters from Hogwarts multiplying through the house, filling the fireplace, erupting from the floorboards, the desperate comedic escalation of a magical system trying to reach one child and being blocked at every turn. She thought about Vernon's face. About the certainty with which she'd believed, that summer and for years before it, that the hostility toward magic in her house was her own hostility. Her own fear. Her own. Not manufactured. Not engineered. Hers. She looked at the wall of the antechamber and let herself be angry about it, quietly, the way she'd been letting herself be angry about things in increments since Cassius Vane had sat at her kitchen table. What happens tomorrow, she said. The subject's response to the DMLE testimony, Rhea said. Castleton will give a closing statement. Then I give mine. Then the panel deliberates and returns findings. She paused. The findings are delivered in 2 stages. First, whether any privileges should be reviewed. Then, if yes, which specific privileges are suspended, restricted, or revoked. How long does the second stage take? Petunia asked. If the panel is prepared, and I believe they are, they can deliver findings within the same session, Rhea said. Ferreira runs tight hearings. She does, Petunia agreed. She'd been watching Ferreira all day, the controlled pacing, the willingness to let silence do work, the specific economy of a chair who trusted the process because she understood it better than anyone else in the room. Harry said, Castleton is going to argue that the expanded scope shouldn't trigger because the DMLE material was presented by Bones without being formally part of the original complaint. Rhea nodded. Yes. And Rhea's going to argue that Regulation 14 Article 9 doesn't require the expanding evidence to originate from the complainant's submission, only that it be presented to the panel at the hearing. Rhea looked at him. Yes. Which is what it says, Harry said. I read it last night. Article 9 is pretty clear. It is, Rhea said. I'm mildly concerned that Castleton is going to try to cite the 1994 Brower Amendment to Article 9, which did briefly restrict the scope expansion authority, but the Brower Amendment was itself amended in 2001 and the restriction was removed. Page 42 of the response brief, Petunia said. Rhea blinked. Yes. I read it, Petunia said. I've read everything you've filed. Rhea looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone revising a characterization. Mrs. Dursley, she said, in 20 years of practice, you're in the top 3 most prepared clients I have ever had. I'm motivated, Petunia said. Morning came gray and cold through the antechamber window. Petunia had slept in a hotel 2 streets away, Rhea had arranged it, and had woken at 5 and lain in the clean, neutral dark of an anonymous room and thought about the day ahead with the same organized focus she'd been bringing to all of it. She showered and dressed and had breakfast at a small cafe that opened at 6, where no one knew her name or her case or had any opinion about any of it, and she found that extremely pleasant. Harry was on the courthouse steps at 8:30, 2 cups of coffee in hand. You didn't have to, she said. I know, he said, giving her one. She accepted it. They stood on the steps in the November cold and drank their coffee and watched the street. The press cluster had grown overnight, she noted, which meant the previous day's testimony had circulated, which meant people had opinions, which was fine. She'd made her peace with people having opinions when she'd sat down with Karen Whitmore and chosen to be the one who told the story first. Inside, the room was exactly as it had been. Same cold stone floor, same gray northern light, same gallery filling with the same quality of attention. Dumbledore was already at his table, looking as composed as he had at the start of yesterday, which she respected even as she had no interest in softening toward it. McGonagall was in the gallery again, 3 rows from the door. The panel filed in at 9. Castleton gave his response to the DMLE testimony. It was good, she acknowledged this privately, covering the Brower Amendment, arguing against expanded scope, citing procedural concerns with the weight and organization of someone who'd prepared through the night. He was thorough and he was correct that the expanded scope question was the closest call of the whole proceeding. Rhea gave her closing. She was 6 minutes. She addressed the Brower Amendment in 45 seconds, the 2001 revision in 30, and spent the remaining 4.5 minutes on one thing, the pattern. Not the individual acts. The pattern. A single mechanism, used 15 times, to take 15 actions that bypassed 15 sets of legal protections. A system designed with safeguards that had been navigated around by someone who understood the system well enough to know where the gaps were. She said it without drama and without crescendo. She said it the way Cassius Vane presented audit findings, in the right order, at the right weight, trusting the material. She sat. Ferreira said, the panel will retire to deliberate. They were gone for 2 hours and 11 minutes. Petunia and Harry and Rhea sat in the antechamber and did not talk much. Harry read something on his phone. Rhea organized papers she'd already organized. Petunia sat with a cup of tea that was actually warm this time and thought about Lily. She thought about the summer Lily got her letter. About the way their parents' faces had looked, lit up, astonished, delighted. About Lily herself, who had been 12 and slightly overwhelmed and had looked at Petunia across the dinner table with the particular expression of a younger sister checking whether her older sister was all right. And Petunia, who was 14 and had already written her letter and received her reply and believed, completely, because why wouldn't she, that the magic in the family had gone to the right sister, had smiled at Lily and said, "It's brilliant, isn't it?" because she'd loved her and the love had been real even when the grief underneath it had also been real. She thought about how Lily had died. About the letter Dumbledore had sent, after, explaining what had happened in the specific way he had of explaining things, making them feel inevitable, the shape of things simply the shape of things. About standing in the hallway of number 4 reading that letter and feeling not grief yet but a strange hollow steadiness, the same steadiness she'd felt her whole life when magical things moved past her at a distance she'd accepted as natural. She'd cried that night, alone, after Vernon was asleep. She'd cried for Lily and for James Potter she'd never met and for a baby who didn't know yet what he'd lost, and she'd been trying, in the thick of that grief, to figure out how to be the right kind of person for what was about to come through the door. She hadn't managed it. She knew that. She'd managed a version of it that was compromised by fear and resentment and a framework someone else had built around her. But the trying had been real. She wanted that on record somewhere, even if only in her own mind. The trying had been real. A knock at the antechamber door. A court clerk. "The panel is ready," he said. Ferreira waited until the room had settled completely. "The panel has reached its findings," she said. "I'll read them in full." She looked down at the page in front of her. On the question of expanded scope, the panel finds, by a vote of 4-1, that the evidence presented by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement representative constitutes sufficient grounds for expanded review under Regulation 14, Article 9, as amended. The scope of this hearing is therefore expanded to include parallel authorization patterns under the subject's chief warlock authority. Castleton's pen moved across his notepad. Once, hard. On the primary question of the suppression certificate issued in 1965, Ferreira continued, "The panel finds unanimously that the certificate was issued without the legal requirements mandated by the Magical Persons Autonomy Act of 1952, without valid consent, without proper danger assessment, and outside the intended scope of the Emergency Authorization Clause. The certificate is declared void and without legal effect from this date forward." Petunia sat very still. The certificate was void. The suppression, 60 years of it, was legally null. She had known this finding was likely. She had prepared for it, discussed it with Rhea, considered its practical implications. And still, hearing it said aloud in a formal room by a person with the authority to make it true, something in her chest did something she couldn't name and didn't try to. Additionally, Ferreira said, "The panel finds that the placement of Harry Potter in the care of the complainant in 1981 was made without legally required wardship proceedings and without magical child welfare oversight, constituting a misuse of the emergency clause." She paused. "We will now address the privilege review findings. The panel has assessed each of the 15 privileges identified in the complainant's submission and supplementary evidence." She turned to the next page. "Privilege 1, she said. The authority to issue suppression certificates under the emergency clause without Wisengamot oversight. This privilege is hereby permanently revoked." The room breathed. Privilege 2. The authority to make child placement decisions for magical minors without standard welfare proceedings. Permanently revoked. Another breath. Privilege 3. The authority to issue confidential directives to British ministry departments without standard interdepartmental review. Suspended pending a full review of all directives issued under this authority in the past 30 years. Privilege 4. The authority to conduct unilateral magical assessments of Muggle-born children's families. Restricted. Future assessments require co-signature from a second senior official. Castleton was writing constantly now. The associate beside him had stopped writing and was simply listening with the expression of someone watching something inevitable. Ferreira read through them steadily. Not quickly. Not slowly. At the exact pace of something that needed to be heard clearly by everyone in the room. Privilege 7. The authority to classify magical incidents as emergency level without external verification. Suspended pending audit review. Privilege 9. The authority to restrict ICW inquiry into British domestic cases by invoking Supreme Mugwump standing. Permanently revoked. Privilege 11. The authority to brief non-magical parties on magical subjects without ministry oversight. Restricted. Requires documentation and departmental sign-off for all future instances. By the time she reached Privilege 15, the gallery had the quality of people who have been holding their breath and can't quite decide when to stop. Petunia sat at the complainant's table with her hands folded and her breathing even, and she counted each one as it was read. Privilege 15, Ferreira said. The authority to use emergency clause authorizations across multiple positions simultaneously to achieve outcomes that neither position could independently authorize. The panel finds this to be a systemic misuse that constitutes the underlying mechanism of all 15 irregular actions identified in this hearing. She looked up. This privilege, which was never formally designated as a privilege but has operated as one in practice, is hereby recognized and immediately and permanently revoked. Any future invocation of emergency authorities by the subject across his simultaneous positions will require prior independent legal review. She set the page down. The total number of operational privileges suspended, restricted, or permanently revoked in this hearing is 15, she said. This constitutes a significant reduction in the subject's scope of independent action. The subject retains his remaining 16 privileges, but the panel formally recommends that the Confederation conduct a broader review of Supreme Mugwump emergency authorities as a structural matter, independent of this case. She looked at Dumbledore. Mr. Dumbledore, these findings take immediate effect. Your legal representatives will receive the full written determination within 48 hours. She placed her pen on the table. This hearing is closed. The room moved in the way rooms do when something has finally stopped happening, all at once, voices and movement and the collective exhale of 40 people who'd been still for a long time. Rhea wrote 3 lines in her legal pad with great precision and then closed it. Harry's hand came briefly to Petunia's shoulder, not sustained, just present, a single point of contact. She nodded. Across the room, Dumbledore sat for a moment at his table while Castleton spoke to him in a low, rapid voice. He wasn't looking at his lawyer. He was looking at the panel's vacated seats, the chairs where 5 people had just read 15 findings aloud, and his expression was something she hadn't seen on him before. Not defeat exactly. Not contrition. Something more private than either, the expression of a man genuinely reckoning with a version of events he hadn't fully assembled until someone else put it in order for him. She watched him for a moment. He turned and found her watching. They looked at each other across the length of the room. He said nothing. She said nothing. The moment lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then Castleton recaptured his attention and he looked away. She turned back to the complainant's table and began gathering her papers. The void finding, she said to Rhea. The certificate being declared void, what does that mean practically? It means the suppression has no legal basis and cannot be enforced, Rhea said. As of today. She paused. Whether your magical capacity recovers fully, and I want to be honest with you, we don't know that for certain. 60 years is a long time and I'm not a healer, but the first step is removing the certificate's authority. Which is done. Who do I see about the rest? I've made an appointment at St. Mungo's, Rhea said. Next Monday. A specialist in suppression reversal. Petunia nodded. She filed that away, a thing to think about in the right order when she was ready for it. Harry said, the press is going to want. I know, she said. Do you want me to? I'll handle it, she said. She gathered the last of her papers and straightened them and put them in the bag she'd brought, and she looked at the room one more time, the cold stone floor, the high windows, the 2 tables facing the panel seats, the gallery emptying out, and she thought, she had built this. She had walked into this room with 47 pages and 212 supporting documents and the clear, organized certainty of someone who had done their preparation, and the room had done what rooms do when you've done your preparation properly. It had held. Cassius Vane was waiting in the corridor outside, looking slightly stunned in the way of people who have set something in motion and are only now accounting for how far it went. He looked at Petunia as she came through the door. 15, he said. 15, she confirmed. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. I wrote the escalation report, he said, and I genuinely wasn't sure. The whole time I was writing it, I kept thinking, this is Dumbledore. They'll find a way to. They didn't, Petunia said. No, he said. They didn't. He paused. Mrs. Dursley, what happens now? For you, I mean. Personally. She thought about St. Mungo's on Monday. About 60 years of suppression and whether anything was recoverable. About a life she'd built in good faith around an absence that had been manufactured for her, and what it meant to have that absence suddenly declared void. About the garden at number 4 that still needed sorting. About Harry, somewhere behind her, talking to Rhea about the press statement. About Lily, who would never know any of this, who was 20 years dead and had spent her short life believing her sister simply wasn't like her. I don't know yet, Petunia said honestly. I'm going to find out. Cassius nodded. He put out his hand and she shook it, and then he gathered his satchel and went down the corridor and through the main doors and back into the ordinary street, and Petunia stood for a moment in the stone-floored corridor of the ICW building and felt the particular quality of an aftermath, the strange, hollow, enormous quiet of a thing that has been completed. Behind her, Harry said, "Ready?" She turned. "Yes," she said. They walked out together into the grey November morning, and the press were waiting on the pavement, and Petunia Dursley walked toward them without slowing down. Chapter 5. After the verdict, the press statement was 3 sentences. Rhea had drafted it and Petunia had cut it down from 11, because 11 sentences was 10 more than the situation required. The 3 she kept were, the ICW hearing has concluded. 15 of Albus Dumbledore's Supreme Mugwump privileges have been suspended, restricted, or permanently revoked. Mrs. Dursley thanks the panel for their careful attention to the evidence. That was it. No triumph. No elaboration. Nothing that could be quoted out of context or used to frame her as vindictive or embittered or anything other than what she was, a person who had asked a proper institution to do its job properly and watched it do so. She read it into the grey November air on the courthouse steps, and then she put the paper in her bag and said, "I won't be taking questions today," and walked to the waiting taxi with Harry beside her, and that was the end of the press conference. The Daily Prophet ran it under the headline "Dumbledore stripped of 15 privileges in single hearing, Supreme Mugwump's authority significantly curtailed." The Magical Review ran Karen Whitmore's follow-up piece, which was longer and more careful and considerably more interesting, covering the structural implications of the panel's scope expansion finding and what it might mean for the ICW's broader review of emergency authorization powers. 3 international wizarding publications ran their own analyses. Algernon Wretch wrote a column that was 940 words and used the word unprecedented 7 times and managed, somehow, to avoid saying anything of substance, which Petunia suspected was its own kind of achievement. The Quibbler, which she hadn't known existed until Harry mentioned it, ran a photograph of the courthouse on its front page with the caption "They said it couldn't be done. She did it anyway." Petunia thought that was slightly excessive but not wrong. She read all of it at the kitchen table on Thursday morning with her tea, made notes on what mattered and what was noise, and then put it all in a file folder and set it on the shelf in the study next to the ones she'd been building for 7 weeks. Then she washed up the breakfast things and went to the garden. The garden genuinely needed doing. She'd been saying this for a month. She put on her old coat and her gardening gloves and she worked through the morning cutting back the overgrown beds and clearing the dead wood and turning the near border that had gone to clay over the autumn, and it was cold and the ground was resistant, and by the time she stopped for lunch her shoulders ached and her boots were muddy and she felt better than she had in weeks. Vernon came home at 5:30 to find her at the kitchen table with the file folders and the legal pad and the gardening gloves still on the counter and something on the stove. He stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. "The news," he said. On the radio. There was something about, they mentioned the hearing. There's coverage on the Muggle radio now, she said, mildly interested. Not directly. A human interest piece. About a woman in Surrey who took on some, he paused, searching for the phrasing, took on some international governing body and won. They didn't use names. But I knew. How did they characterize it, she asked. Favorably, he said. He sounded slightly disbelieving, which she supposed was fair. They said it was about suppressed rights. Civil liberties. He looked at the legal pad. They weren't wrong, were they? No, she said. They weren't. He came into the kitchen and sat at the table, across from her, the way he had that first evening when Cassius Vane's letter had arrived. He'd been doing this more lately, sitting at the table when she was working, not helping, not intruding, just being present in the vicinity of things he didn't fully understand but had stopped trying to manage. The boy, he said. Harry. He was there with you. Yes. Is he, how is he? He's processing, she said. It's a great deal to reckon with, for him. He'd built a very particular picture of Dumbledore. Having that picture, not destroyed, but significantly revised, takes time. Vernon nodded slowly. He picked up one of the newspaper cuttings from the table, the Magical Review piece, with its careful structural analysis, and looked at it without reading it, the way he looked at things in her world when he was trying to be present without claiming to understand. Pet, he said, Vernon. She looked at him steadily. We've talked about what you knew and what you were told and what you did with it. I'm not going to have that conversation again. We either move past it properly or we don't move past it at all, and I'd rather move past it. He looked at her. And can you? She thought about it. I think, she said carefully, that we've both been living in someone else's architecture for a very long time, and the architecture is gone now. What we do with the space is up to us. She paused. But yes. I think so. He nodded. He set the newspaper cutting back on the table. What's on the stove? He asked. Soup, she said. Right, he said, and went to wash his hands. St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries was, Rhea had explained, accessible from a department store in London that Petunia had been to twice and always found overwhelming. The entrance was a window display that looked like it contained mannequins in outdated outfits, and you walked through it if you knew to walk through it, and she did, because Rhea had given her very specific written instructions that she'd read 4 times. Harry had offered to come. She'd told him not to. This was hers. Inside, St. Mungo's was brighter than she'd expected and louder, a bustling, oddly colored building with the particular controlled chaos of any hospital and the additional layer of things she couldn't identify but was willing to catalog later. A welcome which at the front desk, cheerful and efficient, directed her to the 4th floor without blinking at her name. The specialist was a healer named Dr. Isolde Farrow, who was 40-something, clear-eyed, and had the reassuring quality of someone who had seen a very wide range of things and was rarely alarmed by any of them. She had short dark hair and practical robes, and she greeted Petunia in an office that managed to feel both clinical and unhurried. I've read your case summary, Farrow said, settling across from her. Rhea Thornwood sent the certificate and the void finding. I've also pulled the magical person's register, what there is of it, which is the original entry and nothing subsequent, which tells its own story. She folded her hands. I want to be straightforward with you about what we know and what we don't. Please, Petunia said. Magical suppression, when applied to a child before their natural abilities have fully developed, functions differently from suppression applied to an adult, Farrow said. In an adult, the magical capacity is established. You suppress it, you create pressure, the ability pushes against the restriction, sometimes breaks through. In a child, the capacity is still forming. The suppression becomes part of the structure, in a sense. The magic grows around it rather than against it. She paused. The good news is that the certificate being declared void removes the active restriction. The question is what's underneath. You don't know yet, Petunia said. Not without examination, Pharaoh said. I want to be clear, I've seen cases where suppression applied early has caused no lasting capacity reduction, the magic was simply dormant, not diminished, and removal of the restriction produces full access. I've also seen cases where 6 decades of suppression has shaped the channels available, let's say. The capacity is there but attenuated. And I've seen everything in between. What's the examination? Petunia asked. I'd like to do 3 things today, Pharaoh said. A magical signature scan, which tells me the current state of your capacity. A restriction assessment, which shows me whether any residual effects of the certificate remain after the void finding. And a baseline test, I'll ask you to hold a wand and tell you what happens. She paused. Is that all right? Yes, Petunia said. The magical signature scan looked, to Petunia, like nothing at all. Pharaoh passed an instrument the size and shape of a tuning fork slowly along her arm and watched a small disc that glowed in colors Petunia couldn't name. The restriction assessment involved a different instrument and a kind of low humming that Petunia felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. Both took perhaps 20 minutes. Then Pharaoh opened a case on her desk and produced a wand. This is a diagnostic wand, she said. Not tuned to any specific witch or wizard. It won't do much in anyone's hands, it's designed to respond to base magical presence, not to channel it. I'd like you to hold it and just, hold it. Don't try to do anything. Just let it sit. Petunia took the wand. It was plain, pale-colored, unremarkable in her hand. She held it the way she'd held 100 ordinary objects her entire life, firmly, competently, without ceremony. It warmed. Not dramatically. Not with sparks or light or any of the theatrical qualities she'd seen in Harry's world. It simply warmed, steadily and evenly, in a way that was entirely distinct from the warmth of a hand closing around wood. Pharaoh was watching the small disc. All right, she said quietly. She made a note. All right. What does that tell you? Petunia asked. It tells me the capacity is there, Pharaoh said. The channels they're narrower than they should be. 60 years of suppression has left some structural limitation. I won't tell you it's going to be like starting at 11, there will be gaps, areas where the development simply didn't happen because it couldn't, and some of that may be permanent. She looked up. But Mrs. Dursley, you are not a squib. You are not a muggle. You are a witch who was prevented from being one for 60 years, and you can be one now, if you choose to be. The last 4 words sat in the room. If you choose to be. She hadn't thought about it quite that way. She'd been so focused on the complaint, on the process, on making the case, that she hadn't spent much time with the other side of it, the door that the hearing opened. What was through it? Whether she wanted to walk through it at 56, having built a life in the shape of absence, and start learning something she should have learned when she was 8. What would it involve, she asked. Wand training, Pharaoh said. Basic certification work. Most adults in your position work with a specialist tutor. There are programs designed specifically for late developing witches and wizards, people who come to their magic later in life for various reasons. You'd start from the beginning, which is, honestly, Mrs. Dursley, not a disadvantage. Adults who start from scratch often progress faster in certain areas because they approach it with more intentionality than children do. She paused. It would take time. It would require commitment. And you would have to find a wand that's yours, the diagnostic one won't do for actual work. Ollivanders, Petunia said. Pharaoh smiled slightly. Ollivanders, she confirmed. Petunia looked at the diagnostic wand in her hand. At the warmth still present in it. At her own hand, which looked, as it always had, completely ordinary, long fingers, short nails, a small scar on the index finger from a kitchen knife incident in 1987 and a freckle on the back from the summer she'd spent too long in the garden in 1994. Her hand. That she knew. That had always been hers. "Book the first session," she said. "Whatever comes next." Pharaoh nodded and made another note, and Petunia set the diagnostic wand carefully back on the desk and looked out the window of the 4th floor of St. Mungo's at the London sky, which was the same grey as it had been all week, and felt something that she had no particular word for and decided she didn't need one. Harry was waiting outside the department store when she came back through the window display. She stopped on the pavement. "I told you not to come," she said. "I know," he said. "I didn't come to St. Mungo's. I'm standing outside Selfridge's." He had his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of someone who has decided to own a decision. "That's not the same thing." She considered this. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." They walked. There wasn't a particular destination. Harry fell into step beside her and she didn't redirect them, and they moved through the lunch-hour London crowd in the particular way of two people who are both thinking about something and haven't decided to start talking about it yet. After a block and a half, Harry said, "How was it?" "The capacity is there," she said. "Attenuated. But there." He stopped walking. She stopped a pace later and looked back at him. He stopped. Yes," she said. "It's rather a lot." He started walking again, faster. They turned a corner without deciding to. She watched his face, the processing look, the internal recalculation, the specific concentration of someone for whom one thing keeps shifting the shape of another. "He took 60 years from you," Harry said. "Yes. And the panel, the void finding means the suppression is gone, but the 60 years are still gone." "Yes," she said. "That's how time works." He looked at her sharply, and she realized she'd said it too plainly, and then she saw that he wasn't sharp, he was on the verge of something, some specific feeling that was looking for the right form. "I'm sorry," he said. "Petunia." Harry." "No, let me, I've been thinking about what to say for 2 weeks and I keep getting it wrong in my head but I need to actually say it." He stopped walking again. They were on a quiet side street now, the lunch crowd thinned, a row of plane trees dropping their last brown leaves onto the pavement. "I spent 17 years in that house. And for most of it I thought you just didn't want me there. That it was personal. Something about me, specifically, that you couldn't tolerate." He paused. "I know now that the framework was manufactured. I understand that. But the things that happened in that house were real," Petunia said. "Were real," he said. "And I'm not saying, Harry," she said, "stop trying to be generous about it." He blinked. "You're trying to find a way to say that you understand the mitigating factors and that you don't entirely hold it against me," she said. "Which is kind, and I appreciate it, but it's not honest. The cupboard was real. The years of making you feel like a burden were real. I can stand here and explain the entire architecture of how it happened and it doesn't change the fact that you were a child and the house you lived in was not safe for you." He was looking at her with an expression she'd seen on him once before, in the kitchen after she'd told him about the complaint, that quality of finding something he wasn't expecting and wanting to hold it carefully. "I could have done better," she said. "Even within the constraints I was given. I know that. At some point my own choices were my own, regardless of the framework. And I'm not asking you to pretend that doesn't matter." She looked at him steadily. "What I am asking is that we be honest about it. Not generous. Not comfortable. Honest. Because we're capable of it now, I think." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to think about Lily," he said. "Your mum, your sister. Whether she knew. Whether she understood why it was the way it was. She didn't know about the suppression," Petunia said. She thought magic had just passed me by. She loved me anyway, which I've spent 30 years having complicated feelings about. She would have been furious, Harry said. If she'd known. Yes, Petunia said. She would have been. Something passed between them in the quiet of the side street, not resolution, not forgiveness, not the clean narrative arc of a reconciliation scene, but something more actual than any of those things. An acknowledgement. Two people who had been handed each other by a dead woman and a manipulative man and had managed, badly and incompletely, to nevertheless share a world for 17 years, and were now standing on a street in London in November trying to figure out what to do with all of that. I'd like to know you, Harry said. Better, I mean. Going forward. I'd like that too, Petunia said. They started walking again. After a moment, Harry said, Pharaoh. She's good? Very. And the training program, she mentioned a program? For late developing magical ability, Petunia said. Adults who come to it later in life. She said I might progress faster in some areas because I'd approach it with more intentionality. That sounds exactly right, Harry said, with the first actual smile she'd seen on him in 2 days. Don't be smug, she said. I'm not being smug. I'm just saying, don't. He laughed. It was sudden and genuine and slightly surprised, the laugh of someone who wasn't expecting to laugh, and Petunia found, to her own slight surprise, that she was smiling. Dumbledore's response to the findings came in the form of a letter. Not to Rhea. To Petunia, directly, which Rhea called about to say was unusual and potentially significant and possibly an attempt to establish informal communication outside official channels. Should I open it? Petunia asked. That's entirely your decision, Rhea said. I can't advise you on it strategically because there's nothing strategic left at stake, the hearing is closed. This is personal. Petunia looked at the letter. The handwriting was the same. Of course it was. Elaborate, looping, unmistakable. The same hand that had signed a certificate when she was 8 years old. The same hand that had written her the regretful, warmly phrased rejection when she was 11. She opened it. Dear Mrs. Dursley, I will not insult you with explanations you have already heard, or justifications you have already assessed and found wanting. You have been thorough and correct in your assessment and the panel's findings reflect that. What I want to say, what I find I need to say, whether or not it serves any purpose, is that I am sorry. Not in the way of a man managing a situation. In the way of a man who has spent the past 2 weeks reading a case that describes his own actions back to him from the outside and found the view considerably less comfortable than the view from inside. I believed the greater good justified a great many things. I still believe there is such a thing as the greater good. What the hearing demonstrated, with a clarity I should have applied to myself long ago, is that I had appointed myself the sole arbiter of what that good was and who was required to pay its costs. You paid costs you were never asked to bear and never informed you were bearing. So did Harry. So did others. I cannot give you back 60 years. I cannot give Harry back 17. I can only tell you that I will not appeal the findings, I will not challenge the void declaration, and I will cooperate fully with the Confederation's broader review of emergency authorization powers. These are not generous gestures. They are the minimum of what is correct. I hope your work with Healer Pharaoh goes well. She is exceptional. Yours, Albus Dumbledore. Petunia read it once. Then again. She set it on the table. The letter was, she decided, genuine. Not performed, not managed, not the careful construction of someone still trying to control the narrative. It was what it said it was, a man at the end of a very long career looking at a case file and not liking what he found there. Whether that reckoning would produce anything lasting in him was not her problem. It was his, which was exactly where it belonged. She put the letter in the file folder on the study shelf, next to the complaint and the evidence packet and the hearing transcripts. Then she went to make dinner. Minerva McGonagall wrote separately, on Hogwarts stationery, in the compact and undecorated script of someone who wrote letters as a practical matter rather than a performative one. Mrs. Dursley, I gave testimony because it was right to do so. I want you to know that the memo I wrote in 1991, and my decision to accept Albus's response and not escalate, is something I carry. I am not asking for absolution and I am not writing to explain myself. I am writing because I believe in directness and I wanted you to hear directly from me that I was wrong to let it go, and I know it. If there is anything I can do to support Harry's understanding of all of this, I am available. Minerva McGonagall. Petunia read it and thought about the woman on the pavement outside No. 4 the morning after Lily died, in her animagus form, watching them leave for work and school, conducting her surveillance with her characteristic combination of dedication and severity. A woman who had objected and been managed and had filed the objection and then folded it away and got on with things, the way people who work within institutions do when the institution's authority figure is very good at making objections feel handled rather than heard. She wrote back. 4 sentences. She said, "Thank you for your testimony. It required courage. Harry is processing. I'll pass on your offer." She meant all 4 sentences equally. Dudley came on Saturday with Karen Whitmore, who turned out to be an efficient and genuinely warm woman of 30 who had been dating her son for 8 months and was the first person he'd brought home since 2019, which Petunia noted privately as significant. She shook Karen's hand at the door and said, "I've been reading your work since before I knew who you were," and watched Karen's face arrange itself in the particular expression of a journalist meeting someone they've been writing about. "I want to write the follow-up piece," Karen said, at the kitchen table, with the direct manner of someone who had decided to simply state the thing rather than build toward it. "Not about the hearing, that's covered. The follow-up on what comes next. The Healer Pharaoh story, the training program, the question of what happens to someone who gets their magical identity back at 56. That's the story no one's told yet." "I know," Petunia said. "Would you consider?" "Yes," Petunia said. "When there's something to tell." "Not yet. When I've started training and I know what it actually looks like." Karen nodded, and wrote something in her notebook, and didn't push. Dudley sat at the table looking between his mother and his girlfriend with the slightly stunned expression he'd been wearing, on and off, for the past 7 weeks. "You knew," he said to Petunia, not accusingly. "Just checking." "I knew Karen would want the follow-up," Petunia said. "Yes. And you were fine with, she's a good journalist," Petunia said. "I'd rather she tell it than someone who'll sensationalize it." She poured more tea. "Your grandmother used to say, if someone's going to tell your story, make sure it's someone who knows the difference between truth and drama." Dudley looked at her. "Gran never said that." "No," Petunia agreed. "But she would have, if she'd been a journalist instead of a homemaker. She had the instincts." Dudley laughed, the same slightly stunned laugh he'd been producing for weeks, the laugh of a man whose mother keeps being someone slightly different from who he thought she was. Karen smiled. Outside, the November garden, now properly cut back, let the late afternoon light through in a way it hadn't in months, and the kitchen was warm and ordinary and completely, unapologetically itself. Harry came for dinner on Sunday. He brought wine, which he set on the counter, and he helped with the washing up afterward without being asked, and he and Vernon had a conversation about Dudley's job that lasted 20 minutes and was almost entirely unremarkable, which was, Petunia thought, its own kind of landmark. After dinner they sat in the sitting room and Harry said, "I've been thinking about what I want to do." "At work?" "The Auror office?" she asked. "The hearing," he said. "The things that came out of it, the DMLE investigation that Bones couldn't complete, the broader review of emergency powers that the panel recommended. Someone needs to do that work. The auditing, the record review, the systematic assessment of what else was authorized under the same framework." He paused. "I'm good at it, as it turns out. I've been doing it for 7 weeks and I think I'm better at that than I am at chasing dark wizards." "That's not a small thing to admit," she said. "No," he said. But it's true. He looked at the wine in his glass. I spoke to Amelia Bones on Thursday. She said she could second me to the review project. 6 months minimum, possibly longer. You'd take it? She said. I'd take it, he said. If you think, he stopped. I was going to ask if you thought it was a good idea. She looked at him, this man who had spent his childhood waiting to be told he'd done something wrong, who had learned, in the years since, to make his own decisions but still had the instinct of checking, the reflex of seeking sanction from the adults in his life. Harry, she said, you don't need my opinion on your career choices. You're a grown man. I know, he said. I'm asking anyway. She held his gaze for a moment. I think you've spent years doing what the situation required, she said. Fighting the wars that were in front of you. This is the first time I've heard you describe something you want to do because you're genuinely suited to it. She paused. So yes. I think you should take it. He nodded slowly. The firelight caught his glasses in a way that made him look, for just a moment, very young, and then he shifted and it was gone and he was just Harry, sitting in her sitting room on a Sunday evening, drinking wine and thinking about his next chapter. There's something else, he said. Yes? The DMLE review. The records of the emergency clause authorizations, all 23 of them. I've been going through the 8 that appeared legitimate, the ones with proper documentation. He paused. 3 of them involve people. Individuals who were affected by Dumbledore's unilateral decisions. Not suppressions, different kinds of interventions. Things that were done without consent or oversight. Petunia was quiet. They don't know, Harry said. Like you didn't know. They've been living with whatever was done to them and they have no idea there's a record of it, that it was documented, that they'd have standing to request review. She understood what he was asking without him asking it. You want to know if I'd be willing to speak to them. Not to recruit them, he said. Not to build a case. Just, you figured out what to do with the information when Cassius brought it to you. Some of these people may not have a Cassius. They may not know there's a process, or that they have the right to access it, or that someone would take their complaint seriously. He looked at her. You'd know how to say it. What it means to find out. She thought about the gray letter on the kitchen counter. About the decision to open it. About the cup of tea she'd made first. Give me the files when you have them, she said. I'm not promising anything. But I'll look. Harry nodded. Then, after a moment, he said, thank you. Don't thank me yet, she said. Wait until I've seen the files. He almost smiled. Right. Vernon came in from the kitchen and looked at the 2 of them in the firelight and said, there's more wine if anyone wants, and nobody mentioned that it was the first time he'd made that offer to Harry Potter in 30 years of knowing him. Harry looked up. Yeah, he said. I would. Thanks, Uncle Vernon. Vernon went to get the wine. Petunia looked at the fire. The hearing was over. The certificate was void. Somewhere across London in a study she'd never seen, Albus Dumbledore was reckoning with a version of himself that his own letter had admitted he hadn't fully inhabited before now. Somewhere in the ICW, a broader review of emergency powers was being scheduled, with a paper trail that led back to a 47-page complaint filed by a woman in Surrey. Somewhere in St. Mungo's, a case file bore her name and the notation, capacity present, attenuated, training recommended. Somewhere, in herself, in the structure of things, something that had been closed for 60 years was open. She didn't know what she'd find there. She didn't know how much of it was recoverable or what late magic felt like or whether she'd be any good at it or whether it would feel like what she'd lost or like something entirely new. She didn't know what the next chapter looked like, in any of its forms. But she had never, in her life, been afraid of not knowing. She had always been afraid of being told, by someone else, with authority she hadn't thought to question, that the knowing wasn't hers to do. That was done. What came next was hers. Chapter 6. What Petunia built 6 months is long enough to change the shape of a life. Not completely. Not in the way of stories that skip forward and arrive at people transformed beyond recognition, their old selves a distant country they no longer visit. 6 months is more specific than that. It's long enough to develop a habit, long enough for something difficult to start feeling natural, long enough to look back at who you were at the beginning and recognize both the distance and the continuity. Petunia kept her kitchen, her garden, her Tuesday routine of groceries and her Thursday routine of the library and the particular brand of tea she'd drunk every morning since 1978 and had no intention of changing. These were not concessions to the old life or resistances to the new one. They were simply hers, the way a wand was hers, specific, chosen, calibrated to her and no one else. The wand had been the first thing. Ollivander's was on Diagon Alley, which she'd reached by the leaky cauldron on a grey December morning with Harry beside her and the specific focused attention she'd been bringing to everything in her new world, not wonder, exactly, not the wide-eyed arrival of someone encountering magic for the first time, because she wasn't, she'd grown up adjacent to it, she'd lived beside it her whole life, but recognition. The particular quality of recognition. Garrick Ollivander himself was a very old man with large pale eyes that saw more than eyes usually bothered to, and he looked at her across his counter with an expression that moved, in quick succession, through surprise, reassessment, and then the specific settled interest of a craftsman encountering an unusual commission. "Mrs. Dursley," he said. "Mr. Ollivander," she said. "I need a wand." "You do," he agreed, and went to his shelves. He tried 7 before he found it. The first 6 had the quality of polite failures, they produced small, apologetic sparks and went quiet, the way a key doesn't quite catch in a lock. The 7th was 12¼ inches, hornbeam, phoenix feather core, with a slight flex that she wouldn't have described as notable but that Ollivander described as decisive. When she closed her hand around it, the warmth was immediate and specific and entirely different from the diagnostic wand at St. Mungo's, not just heat but fit, the particular rightness of a thing that belongs. The wand moved and the air in the shop rearranged itself. Ollivander's display cases rattled once, gently, and a small shower of golden light came off the tip like scattered water, and Petunia stood in the dim and cluttered shop holding a 12¼ hornbeam wand and felt something she had no previous context for and did not try to name. "Hornbeam chooses owners of deep conviction," Ollivander said, watching her with those pale eyes. "It tends toward those who have decided something important and means to see it through." He paused. "It is a wand that remembers." "Good," Petunia said. "So do I." She paid and left with the wand in a narrow box in her bag, and outside on the street Harry looked at her and said, "Well," and she said, "Hornbeam," and he said, "Of course it is," in the tone of someone whose expectation has been confirmed. The training program was called the Aldgate Center for Adult Magical Development, which was a slightly unglamorous name for something that had been, according to its director, doing genuinely important work since 1978. It operated out of a building near Aldgate East that had the interior dimensions of something considerably larger than its exterior and smelled of old stone and fresh parchment and something faintly electrical that Petunia eventually identified as the ambient residue of a lot of simultaneous magic in an enclosed space. Her tutor was a woman named Blythe Ashworth, who was 63 and had been teaching late-developing magical adults for 25 years. She was small and neat and wore her white hair in a plait, and she had the particular quality of someone who had taught long enough to know that the best thing a teacher can do is get out of the way of the learning. Their first session was a Tuesday afternoon in December. "Before we do anything with the wand," Blythe said, "I want to know what you understand about magic. Not the technical framework, your instinct. How you've observed it working, from the outside." Petunia thought about it. "Like pressure," she said. "A thing that exists and needs somewhere to go. I've watched it build and release my whole life in the people around me. The children at school who were later identified as magical, there was always something in the air around them, something that needed managing before they could manage it themselves. Lily," she paused. My sister had it from very early. It was present. Alive. Sometimes imprecise. And you could sense it, Blythe said. Not just observe it. Sense it. Yes, Petunia said. Though I didn't understand why until recently. Because yours was there too, Blythe said. Suppressed but not absent. Your ability to read magical presence in others was, in a sense, your own magic looking out through the only gap available to it. She paused. That's actually useful. You have 60 years of observational data about how magic behaves, filtered through your own magical perception. Most adults who come here late have no such foundation. You do. Is it enough? Petunia asked. It's a start, Blythe said. Which is all any first session requires. She gestured at the wand on the table between them. Let's begin. They began. The first 4 weeks were technical and often frustrating in the specific way of acquiring a new skill as an adult, the slow, recursive progress of someone who understands conceptually what they're trying to do and cannot yet make their body cooperate with their understanding. She produced light reliably within a week. She moved small objects within 2. She managed her first transfiguration in the 3rd week, a pebble to a button, imperfect, slightly lopsided, but unambiguously a button, and sat looking at it with the concentrated satisfaction of someone who has cracked a code they have been working on for a long time. The attenuation, Blythe said, watching her, is real. Some areas of the standard curriculum will take you longer than they'd take someone who started at 11. You'll find workarounds in some cases. In others you'll simply develop at your own pace. She paused. But your precision is exceptional. Your control, even at this stage, is unusual. Most new adults are imprecise, they have power but can't direct it. You don't have the raw power of someone who's been practicing for 40 years, but what you produce exactly. It's the only way I know how to work, Petunia said. I know, Blythe said. Hornbeam would choose someone like that. By February she could perform basic charms, elementary transfiguration, and a moderate shield charm that Blythe described as solid. She attended the Allgate Center twice a week and practiced at home in the study, which she'd cleared for the purpose, and she read extensively, the theory of magic, its history, the various frameworks through which different traditions understood it, with the same focused appetite she'd brought to every topic she'd ever decided to understand properly. The study had become, gradually, a room she worked in and a room she learned in simultaneously. The file folders were still there, the complaint, the hearing transcripts, the evidence packets. Beside them now were her training notes, Blythe's recommended reading list, 3 increasingly advanced spellwork manuals, and a small stand she'd bought specifically to rest her wand on when she wasn't using it, because she preferred her desk organized and a wand rolling around loose was an untidiness she found distracting. Vernon, to his credit, asked thoughtful questions about the training and did not flinch when she demonstrated things in the kitchen. He'd drawn his line at the study. What happened in the study was, by unspoken agreement, its own country, but the kitchen was shared territory and she respected that. She was working at home one February afternoon, practicing a Lumos variation that Blythe had set her, when Vernon appeared in the study doorway with a cup of tea and said, "Post," and handed her an envelope. It was from the ICW. The Confederation's broader review of emergency authorization powers had been running since December under the joint oversight of Amelia Bones' department and an ICW working group. Harry had been seconded to it in January, as he'd planned, and she knew from their weekly dinners, which had become a fixture, Sunday evenings, Harry bringing wine and occasionally Ginny Weasley, who turned out to be a sports journalist with a very direct manner and a genuine interest in everything, which Petunia found refreshing, that the review was finding exactly what they'd suspected it would find. The letter from the ICW was not from the review board. It was from Adjudicator Ferreira. Dear Mrs. Dursley, I am writing in my personal capacity to inform you that the broader review of emergency authorization powers has, as of this month, formally adopted the panel's findings from November as its foundational framework. Your case, and the evidentiary standard your complaint established, will serve as the basis for assessing all prior uses of the emergency clause across all ICW member nations. Additionally, the ICW Magical Persons Oversight Committee has proposed formal amendments to the Magical Persons Autonomy Act, to be presented to the full Confederation in spring, strengthening consent requirements and establishing independent oversight mechanisms for suppression proceedings. The proposal cites your case directly. I mention these developments because I believe you should know the scope of what your complaint has produced, beyond the specific findings of the hearing. You came to us with 47 pages. What came out of those pages is somewhat larger than that. With respect and admiration, Isolde Ferreira, Chief Adjudicator, ICW Privileges Division. Petunia read it twice. Then she set it on her desk beside the wand stand and sat with it for a while. She thought about Cassius Vane at her kitchen table with his overfull satchel. About the gray letter she'd almost not opened. About the cup of tea she'd made herself before she opened it, that small act of steadying, of grounding herself in the ordinary before walking into the difficult. About 47 pages built from 7 weeks of precise, organized, deliberate work, the same way she'd built every difficult thing in her life, by being thorough and being decided and not flinching from the specific weight of what needed doing. She thought about all the things that had followed from those 47 pages. The void finding. The 15 privileges. The broader review. The amendments to the Autonomy Act that would mean some child, somewhere, in some future year, would not grow up the way she had grown up, cut off from themselves, made smaller than they were, handed an absence and told it was simply who they were. That child would not know her name. They wouldn't need to. She picked up her wand and completed the Lumos variation she'd been practicing, and the study filled with a clean, precise light, and she sat in it for a while before she went to call Harry and tell him about Ferreira's letter. The follow-up piece ran in the Magical Review in March. Karen Whitmore had been patient. She'd come twice to the Aldgate Center, at Blythe's permission, and observed sessions, never intrusive, always at the back of the room with her notebook, the specific unobtrusive quality of a journalist who understood that the thing you were there to observe only existed if you let it. She'd interviewed Blythe, and Healer Farrow, and spent an afternoon at the ICW reviewing publicly accessible records from the hearing for context she already had but wanted to verify. The piece was called What Comes After. It opened, in the training room at the Aldgate Center on a Wednesday in February. Petunia Dursley is attempting a Lumos variation for the 11th time. She is not frustrated. She is not performatively calm in the way of someone managing frustration. She is simply working, with the focused, methodical attention she brings to everything, the same attention she brought to a 47-page ICW complaint, to 7 weeks of evidence preparation, to a privileges hearing that stripped 15 authorizations from the most powerful wizard in Britain. The Lumos variation, she will tell you, is harder than the complaint was. The complaint, she says, was just organization. This requires something she hasn't finished developing yet. She says this without distress, as a statement of current fact, and then she tries it again. It was, Petunia thought, exactly right. The piece went on to cover the training program, the Farrow assessment, the structural implications of the hearing's findings, and the proposed amendments to the Autonomy Act. It quoted Petunia directly on several points, including one that ran, later, in 3 other publications and was apparently shared extensively in wizarding discussion forums. I'm not rebuilding a life. I built a life. What I'm doing now is adding to it. There's a difference between starting over and expanding. I'm not starting over. I'm 56 years old and I know exactly who I am. I'm just finding out what else I can do. She'd meant it. It was important to her that people understood she'd meant it, that this wasn't the story of a woman who'd been rescued, or restored, or returned to some original state that represented her truest self. She'd been truest to herself in this process, in the building and filing of the complaint, in the preparation of the evidence, in the choosing of the wand and the standing in the training room and the trying again. That was who she was. That had always been who she was. The magic was an addition. Not a foundation. Harry came for Sunday dinner in April with Ginny and a slightly distracted energy that Petunia had learned meant he had something to tell her. "The review," he said, over the main course. "We've found 2 more. Like you." She set her fork down. 2 people, he said. 1 in Wales, 1 in Scotland. Both adults, both living as non-magical, both with irregularly issued suppression certificates in their files. Different circumstances from yours, different time periods, different apparent motivations, but the same mechanism. "Dumbledore?" she asked. One is a different signatory, a ministry official from the 1980s who is now deceased. But the pattern is the same. Emergency clause. No proper documentation. No review records. "They don't know," she said. "They don't know," he confirmed. "Have you told Cassius?" "He's already on it," Harry said. "He filed preliminary findings with the ICW this week. Formally, the review board handles the notification. But," he paused. "The person in Wales. Her name is Margaret Holt. She's 44. She has 2 children, both at Hogwarts." He looked at Petunia. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to be listed as a contact in the notification letter. Not to tell her what to do. Just, so she has a name. Someone who's been through it." Ginny was looking at her plate with the careful attention of someone deliberately not influencing the answer. Vernon, at the other end of the table, was cutting his chicken with slightly more focus than required. "Yes," Petunia said. "List me." Harry nodded. "And the 1 in Scotland, 1 at a time," Petunia said. "List me for Wales first. We'll come back to Scotland." "Right," Harry said. He relaxed slightly. "Right. Yes." Ginny looked up and reached for her wine and said, "Vernon, you were telling me about Dudley's new business thing, the fitness class?" And the table moved on, the way tables do when the significant thing has been said and settled and there's dinner left to finish. The letter from Margaret Holt arrived on a Tuesday in late April. It was handwritten, which surprised Petunia. She'd half expected an email, if Margaret was non-magical and living ordinarily. But it was handwritten, careful script on plain paper, and it was 6 sentences long. "Dear Mrs. Dursley, the review board sent me a letter. I've read it 4 times and I still don't quite believe it. Your name was in it, as someone I could contact. I don't know what I want to ask. I don't know if I'm angry or relieved or just, I don't have the word for it. I thought I'd write anyway. Yours, Margaret Holt." Petunia read it and recognized every sentence. The rereading. The not quite believing. The absence of a word for the specific feeling that existed in the gap between what you'd thought was true and what was true. She wrote back that afternoon. Not an explanation. Not a guide. Just a letter, the way she'd been learning to understand things needed to be, straightforward, present, not more than what the moment required. "Dear Margaret, you don't have to know what you want to ask yet. You don't have to have the word for it yet. That part comes later, if you keep sitting with it. What I can tell you is this, the process that exists is real and it takes you seriously. The people in it, the ones worth trusting, are Rhea Thornwood for the legal side and Healer Farrow at St. Mungo's if you want to understand the medical picture. You don't have to do any of it quickly. You don't have to do any of it at all. But if you decide you want to, I did it, and it was worth doing, and you can call me Petunia Dursley." She included her phone number at the bottom. Margaret called 3 days later, on a Friday morning. Petunia was in the kitchen when the phone rang, and she answered it and said, "Margaret," before the other woman could speak, because she recognized the quality of the breathing, the specific held quality of someone who has made a phone call they weren't sure they'd make. "How did you know it was me?" Margaret asked. "Because you're the only person who would call at exactly this time on a Friday," Petunia said. "It's the moment when you've been building up to it all week and you can't wait any longer, but you're also not entirely ready, so you go for it before you can talk yourself out of it. A pause. Yes. That's exactly right. Sit down, Petunia said. I'll put the kettle on, metaphorically. How long do you have? An hour, Margaret said. Before I have to collect my youngest from nursery. That's plenty, Petunia said. Tell me where you are. Not geographically. Where you are with it. And Margaret told her. She talked for 20 minutes, which was what she'd needed to do, the whole complicated layered thing of it, the shock of the letter, the children she'd never told about any of it, the husband who knew something was different about her and had never known what to call it, the years of ordinary life built around an absence she'd understood as simply a fact of herself. She cried once, briefly, and didn't apologize for it. Petunia listened. She didn't offer solutions or trajectory or the reassurance of her own outcome as a template. She just listened, and occasionally said something specific, not "it will be all right" or "I understand exactly," but the actual thing she'd noticed in what Margaret had said, reflected back precisely. When Margaret had finished, she said, "So you went through all of it? The complaint and the hearing and all of it?" "Yes," Petunia said. "Was it worth it?" Margaret asked. Petunia thought about Ferreira's letter on her desk beside the wand stand. About Blythe in the training room and the button that had been a pebble and the Lumos variation tried for the 11th time. About Harry and Sunday dinners and the file folders on the study shelf and the garden properly cut back and a life that was still, fundamentally, the life she'd built, just larger now. "Yes," she said. "Though not necessarily in the way you might expect. The hearing wasn't the end of something. It was just, it moved the walls. Made the space bigger." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I've got a 4-year-old, she said. "And 2 at Hogwarts. It's not a great time to, it's never a great time," Petunia said. "I was 56. You find the time you have." Another pause. "I'm going to call Rhea Thornwood," Margaret said. "Good," Petunia said. "She'll tell you exactly what to expect and she won't oversell it or undersell it. She'll just tell you the truth." Yeah. That's what I need." A pause. "Mrs. Dursley, Petunia," she said. "Petunia." A small hesitation, and then something that might have been the beginning of a steadied breath. "Thank you. Call me when you've talked to Rhea," Petunia said. "I'll be here." She put the phone down and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with her hand still on it, feeling the specific quality of having done a useful thing. Not a resolved thing, not a completed thing. Margaret had weeks and decisions and a great deal of difficulty still ahead of her. But a real thing. A thing that had mattered to the person it needed to matter to in the moment it needed to matter. She made a cup of tea and took it to the study. On her desk, the wand stand, the wand. The Ferreira letter. The file folders, complaint, hearing, evidence. Beside them, the training notes, the spellwork manuals, Blythe's reading list with her annotations in the margins, increasingly dense as the months went on and she found she had more to say about it than she'd expected. On a separate smaller shelf that Vernon had put up for her in January without being asked, the letters. McGonagall's. Dumbledore's. Cassius Vane's original grey envelope, which she'd kept for reasons she hadn't fully articulated but which had something to do with acknowledging the beginning of things. She sat at her desk with her tea and opened her training notebook to the current page. She had a session with Blythe tomorrow. She was working on intermediate transfiguration, the theoretical framework was clear to her, the execution still variable, the kind of variable that resolved with sustained practice rather than any fundamental revision of approach. She'd been practicing the same base sequence for 2 weeks, finding it slightly different each time, which Blythe said was the nature of transfiguration and the nature of Hornbeam specifically. It worked by iteration, by the accumulation of precise attempts, each one building on the last. She made her notes for tomorrow's session. What she wanted to try. What she wanted to ask Blythe. Where she thought the blockage was and what she thought might address it. She wrote clearly and in order, the way she'd always worked, the way she'd worked on the complaint and on everything else, because it was simply who she was. At 5:30, the phone rang again. "Harry. Ferreira's written to the full Confederation," he said, without preamble. "The proposed Autonomy Act amendments are going to a vote in June." "I saw her letter," Petunia said. "She wrote to me in February." Of course she did." He paused. "Are you all right with it? With how far it's gone?" She thought about the question seriously, the way she'd been trying to think about things. The broader review had found 2 people so far. There would likely be more. The Autonomy Act amendments, if passed, would affect future cases across all ICW member nations. Something she'd started in her kitchen on a Tuesday in October had become, through 47 pages and 212 supporting documents and a single hearing in a converted Victorian courthouse, a structural change to the framework of an entire international institution. She hadn't planned it that way. She'd planned to hold one man accountable for one specific thing. But accountability, she'd learned, wasn't a contained procedure, it was a question, once genuinely asked, that kept finding new rooms to open. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right with it." "Good," Harry said. "Sunday dinner?" "Sunday dinner," she confirmed. "Bring Ginny." "She's already planning to," he said. "She says she's bringing something from a French place she found in Soho and Vernon is apparently looking forward to it," Petunia said. "I know. He told me. Don't be late." "I won't be late," Harry said, with the slightly affronted certainty of someone who was constitutionally incapable of being late and found the reminder unnecessary. She put the phone down. Outside, the April evening was doing something nice with the light, the late sun coming long in gold through the study window, catching the wand on its stand, catching the dust motes, catching the edges of her file folders and her training notes and the small index tabs she'd added to the evidence packet after the hearing, out of habit, because it was more useful organized than not. She picked up her wand. She tried the transfiguration sequence. It was better than yesterday. Not perfect, the surface texture resolved unevenly, the grain of the material slightly approximate rather than precise, which was the specific problem she'd been working on and hadn't cracked yet. She noted it. She tried it again, adjusting the angle of approach. Better again. Not quite there. She noted that too, and tried again, and the April light shifted through the window, and the garden outside was green with the beginning of spring, and Petunia Dursley sat at her desk in the house she'd built and the life she'd built and worked at the thing she was learning, and tried it again, and when she got it, she would note that too. She always did. The Autonomy Act amendments passed the full ICW vote in June, by 31 votes to 4. Rhea sent a bottle of wine. Cassius Vane sent a card with a small wax stamp on the back, a set of scales inside a circle of stars, the same stamp from his first letter, and 3 words inside, worth escalating. Karen Whitmore texted from a press gallery somewhere to say the Magical Review was running the story as its cover. Blythe, at their Tuesday session, said nothing about it and gave Petunia a particularly difficult transfiguration to attempt, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Harry brought it up on Sunday, briefly, and then moved on, because they'd both understood by then that the work was its own reward and the coverage was the coverage and neither of them needed to perform significance at each other across a dinner table. Amelia Bones sent a formal Department of Magical Law Enforcement letter confirming that the review had been expanded and 3 additional cases had been identified, 2 in Britain and 1 in Ireland, and that Mrs. Dursley's contact information had been shared with the relevant parties with her prior consent. Margaret Holt had filed her complaint in May. Rhea was handling it. And on a Tuesday in June, Petunia Dursley sat her Level 1 Magical Certification Assessment at the Aldgate Center, in a room with 4 other adults of various ages and backgrounds, and passed it with a distinction in practical application that Blythe recorded in the register with the specific economy of a woman who was not surprised and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The certificate was plain parchment, official stamp, her name in printed lettering. She brought it home and put it in the study. not on the wall. In the file with the other things that mattered, the complaint, the void finding, the training notes, Ferreira's letter. She sat at her desk for a while after that. The evening was warm and the window was open and the garden was doing well this year, better than last, the beds properly managed now and the near border finally recovered from the years of neglect. She thought about the grey letter on the kitchen counter in October. About the cup of tea she'd made before opening it. About the particular quality of stillness that came before a decision. She thought about Lily, which she did often, more easily now than she had for years, less grief and more something warmer, some quality of carrying rather than mourning. She thought about what Lily would have made of all this. Lily, who had always been direct, always impatient with the complicated indirect routes people took to obvious conclusions, who would have read the 47-page complaint and said yes, obviously, took you long enough. She smiled at the study wall. Took you long enough, she thought back, which was how she talked to the dead when she talked to them, honestly, a little wryly, without ceremony. Then she opened her training notebook to a fresh page and wrote, Level 2. Starting from the beginning. What I need to understand first. She wrote for an hour. By the time she finished, the summer evening had gone fully dark, and the garden was all shadow and scent, and the house was quiet except for the television in the sitting room and Vernon's particular brand of commentary on whatever sport was on, and Petunia Dursley sat at her desk with her hornbeam wand on its stand beside her, and her work in front of her, and 56 years of a life she'd built herself, and whatever years came after it. There was a great deal left to learn. She looked forward to it.